Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 9th virtual Diverse Ed event. My name is Hannah Wilson. I'm here with my wingwoman.
And I'm Bennie Cara.
And we're really excited to be hosting another lineup of 12 fantastic speakers for you today. So before we go to our first speaker, we thought we'd just do a bit of a roundup, some updates about all the things that have been happening in the Diverse Ed Network over the last 12 months. So firstly, the book obviously came out in April, and it's been fantastic to hear all the brilliant reviews from the book. We love hearing when it's been amplified and seeing our contributors speaking at events. There's been lots of mobility around the country and beyond this week. So fantastic contributions there from everybody. We've now got the podcast. So two of our contributors, Nick Kitchener-Bentley and Yamina Bibi, are our Diverse Ed podcast co-hosts, and they have interviewed one contributor from each of the chapters. So please do go onto our website and find the podcast. We are now up to 24 DEI toolkits. So thank you to everybody who has been commissioned to curate those toolkits through the lens of lived experience. We've got a couple of our contributors actually on the lineup today, and we get fantastic feedback about how they're being used in schools in a really proactive way, particularly around self-directed learning. Some schools now give you overtime for CPD, PLD, and thinking about how you can utilise those resources there. We're getting fantastic feedback. And on the website now, we've got brochures outlining all the different things that we are doing, but also our team of growing associates are doing as well. The team has grown. We are at capacity, and it's fantastic to have other people now joining the training delivery lineup, and some of them you'll hear from shortly. Bennie, what else? What else is new?
So I think the most important and exciting thing that's happened for me is that we launched our Leading the Diverse Curriculum program, which is a series of 6 sessions. We had 26 people in the first cohort, and then we very quickly filled up the second cohort of 25 people, and we are starting a waiting list for cohort 3. And we had our first session on yesterday morning, and it was an absolute joy to talk to people about what it means to actually meaningfully diversify the curriculum. So it's hugely exciting, and I know we've got a section today on curriculum. We've got some really great speakers lined up for that. I am going to start to introduce our first session because we've got some great speakers lined up for the first session. As usual, there'll be 3 speakers and then a question and answer, and then a bit of a comfort break. So our first speaker is Audrey Pantelis, who will be talking about intersectional identities. We will then have Abid Ahmed, who will be supporting young people, who will be talking about supporting young people and colleagues who stammer, a really important point. And then we will also have Nicky Bright, who will be talking about goals for raising menopause awareness, an issue that affects a lot of people. We are slightly ahead of schedule, but we are going to just go over to Audrey. Audrey, good morning. There's always one.
I knew I was going to do that. I thought to myself, I won't be that person. I won't be that person. Good morning.
No, right. And over to you, Audrey. Tell us.
Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Hannah. Good morning, Bennie. And it's great to be with you this morning at the Diverse Educators Conference. So this morning, I'm talking a little bit about intersectionality, and I'm going to be talking about the idea of it, the concept of it, which we know is probably coming more to the fore as we kind of delve deeper into the space of diversity, equity and inclusion. So where does it come from? The phrase itself comes from an expression, a concept coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw back in 1989. And she was talking about it with regards to the concepts of sex or gender, and thinking very much about that with regards to race. And if you like to kind of illustrate it a little bit more, the way in for me definitely has been the understanding that what might affect all females doesn't necessarily affect me as a Black female. And so my lens has always been different, and it's been something definitely that I've felt throughout my adult life. When I'm listening to concepts, when I'm listening to reports or theories being given about feminism, I'm loving it and I'm thinking this is great. But then I'm also thinking, but I've got a slightly different lens. It feels slightly different for me. And so the concept, when it started, when Kimberly Crenshaw was talking about it, was to do with race and gender. And she kind of gave, and I'm just going to quote from what she said is when we put these two different concepts together, these two different protected characteristics together, systems of inequality based on maybe gender or race or ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, class, and other forms of discrimination intersect to create unique dynamics and effects. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? When we start to recognize that our lenses are all different, when we look at them in different ways, then we're thinking about the way in which we approach the world and the ways in which the support that we need to ensure that we are accessing the world in a fair and equitable way. So it's the idea that recognizes that humans hold myriad identities, and that the overlap and the intersection is a thing, it's real, and it also means that because it makes us more complex, that we have to think about the different ways in which we can support, encourage, and also acknowledge, you know, to a certain extent, the privilege that some of us will hold. And it allows us to look at these different lenses. It allows us to examine while not feeling kind of beaten down or feeling in such a way that you're apologetic about those experiences that you may encounter. And of course, you can encounter these through work or obviously in your everyday life. So we don't think to ourselves, okay, then, right, oppression and domination happens in a nice, neat thing. So if you are Black, this is the only stuff that you're going to experience. If you are, transgender, this is the stuff you're going to experience, etc. The reality is life is complex, life is messy, and it does overlap. And so, of course, what we're trying not to do is to say, my stuff is worse than your stuff. We're not saying that oppression wise, you know, I want to win the prize because I feel more oppressed because I'm this, and this. It's not about that at all. It really isn't. It's more about the idea of recognizing what they are, how they are, and what we can do to be, you know, cognizant of that, and how we can adapt the way in which we either within our workplaces, especially in schools, we address that and we acknowledge that, and also the ways in which we can make sure that we can support one another. So it also sometimes makes you feel as if, gosh, there's so much out there that actually, what do I do? How do I start to even address this? Because if it's not in your own lived experience, then how are you possibly going to know? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, as the ways in which we can possibly kind of start to do this as we think about the goals and the ways in which we can actually try to make sure that this happens. But what we've got to think about is recognizing, as I say, those experiences. And I think what we've got to also make sure that we don't do, as I say, is to pit against one another. I also think one of the things that we have to think about in intersectionality, because it started with race and gender, but actually we now use it for a number of the combination of protected characteristics. So it's about knowing that because it is so complex, knowing that it is actually going to be a challenge to recognize it when it's not necessarily your own lived experience, that we hear from the people that have those intersectional identities, and that we recognize what we can do to support. So let's have a look. If we have a look at the slide, if Richard, you could put the slide up, please. Got a couple of suggestions, some things that we might want to think about, some strategies that we might want to make work. So you can see I've put them into some categories there for you. And so if you are a teacher and you might be thinking to yourself, well, I don't quite know what that might look like, you might want to start thinking about the idea of biases, thinking about the things that are known, and thinking about the things in which you can challenge some of those biases, where you can actually think about the ways in which you can maybe set up maybe a weekly provocation, a question, and then get the conversation going. Because some people might not even know anything about intersectionality at all, but by doing that, but through a question, you're starting that conversation, you're encouraging that viewpoint to start to happen. If you are a leader, for example, in any shape or form, middle leader, senior leader, you might want to start looking at your employees and actually looking to see who you have. Now, some people won't want to necessarily acknowledge or kind of bring to the front their identities, but you will be capturing data from different sources. So you've got that data already. You might want to just look at the data that you've got and start to address some of those intersectionalities that you might be able to see, or you might also want to kind of through surveys or setting up of employer resource groups actually engender these groups to happen naturally. So this is a slow one in the fact that some people will want to talk about things, some people won't. So don't worry too much if you get a slow response. It's about building up that culture. If you're a support member of staff, you might want to think about stereotypes. So again, similar to having a weekly question, it might simply be, look around us. Let's look around us and see where we can actually highlight those and challenge those stereotypes. So it might be within the school, it might be out of the school. And usually it's quite easy to look at the media and to identify where you can see intersectional identities been seen and, being visual and recognizing that actually, it's all fine. So finding some famous people maybe who have got some clear protected characteristics that intersect and then talking about them. And also, of course, looking from within the community. I think that's really important. Look to see what you've got within your own setting. And then for everyone, regardless of your position, it's about what you are doing, how you are approaching intersectionality. What behaviours are you seeing? Do you recognise that actually the viewpoint that a young Black woman will be different to a young white woman or a young Asian woman? And how are you addressing it? Remember, we're not trying to pit people against one another. We're not trying to, get into the oppression Olympics and say yours is worse than mine, etc. But what are you doing just to address that? So how do you ensure that you are inclusive? How do you ensure that the culture that you are creating within your school encourages safety, encourages people to, as I say, talk about their identities, or possibly even people that might think to themselves, actually, you know what? I don't necessarily want to talk about it, but I want to feel okay about not talking about it, but also recognizing that when I'm ready to, I can. So these are some of the strategies that I'm suggesting that you might want to think about. And even just doing the one will be amazing. It will be absolutely amazing, because what you are then doing is encouraging and enabling those people with those intersectional identities to feel safe enough to talk about some of their challenges, some of their joys, and also the ways in which they can be supported, because not everybody wants to talk about the support that they need, but they do need that culture. They do need to feel safe. And so as we finish and come into land now, when we're thinking about just one group, remember, then that's all you're seeing. But we know that everyone is complex. We know that everyone has a myriad of identities that sometimes they want to reveal, sometimes they don't. So we want people to understand. We want people to listen to understand. And so let's encourage and let's set up the culture that enables that to happen. Let's think about our behaviours that enables that behaviour that we want to see to be able to thrive. Thank you.
Morning, my friend. It's lovely to see you, and thank you for opening our event today. I was going to say a massive welcome as well to everyone who has joined us in the audience. We've got a very international audience today. We've got people in Kuala Lumpur, Baku, Oman, Cornwall, Norfolk, Suffolk. So thank you for joining us in the audience. And please do be interactive in the chat. Post comments and questions for the speakers, and Bennie and I can then share them. So whilst I wait for you to type some thoughts into the chat, thank you, Audrey, for unpacking intersectionality, because it's one of those terms that gets bandied around quite a lot, and people aren't always completely clear what it means. So I just want to do a little bit further probing. So this idea of intersectionally data handling, so thinking about how we look at data for the children in an intersectional way, and how we could or should be looking at the data for the adults in the workforce in an intersectional way. Can you just tease that out a little bit further for the audience?
Yeah, no problem. So it's interesting, in schools especially, we do a lot, don't we? When we're looking at data with regards to progress, we say, right, okay then, so how are boys boys doing? How are the girls doing, etc.? And we capture all of that. And then, of course, what we can start to do with the data that we already have is to start subdividing that. So it may well be, as already probably is the case, we look at Black Caribbean boys, we look at Black African boys, etc. So we can start to subdivide that. We can do that again. We tend to do it mostly, interestingly, with boys. We don't do it so much with girls. And maybe there's some work to be done there in actually really understanding that we do that with special educational needs, etc. So there's a lot of things that we already do where we can start to, free school meals, English as an additional language, etc. So I think there are some different ways in which we can do the same things that we're doing, but we just think about the different categories and we think about the ways in which we can unpack that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I was spending hours, sorry, don't cut you off there, spending hours as a classroom teacher, as a head of department, faculty leader, doing all that demographic data handling for my pupils, knowing who was attending, behaving, all those different categories. And I don't think people see that as being us being aware of the intersectional layers that people are experiencing. How about the staff then? What I'm thinking about today's theme of goals and the educators on the call. What would you like them to be doing differently with the staff around the data around the staff when it comes to intersectionality?
Well, this is it. And I think this is the culture thing, really. And this is the bit that's probably you will have to, tread carefully, tread slowly, but it's that culture piece, really. So it's more to do with, if you on the slide that I talked about with leaders about setting up groups and setting up the encouragement of people being able to talk about how they present, I guess, how they are within their settings, but the culture's got to be right. So sometimes you can see schools meaning really well and wanting to set something up by saying, right, we're going to have this, we're going to have that. And people are going, I'm not getting involved in that, because actually it's quite exposing. It makes you see it's quite, you're quite vulnerable. So I think it's probably start the same way for schools, start the same way as you do with students, and maybe encourage in the first instance people, if they want to, set up a group, employ resource groups to start to kind of address those issues.
I'm just thinking about the adult data though, and about, like, from a HR point of view, thinking about who we're recruiting, who we're retaining, who we're promoting. That data can get really interesting, can't it? When we look at the fact that we're losing women from the sector, but are we losing women who have got children, or women who are women of colour, or women of faith? Like, for me, it's like that. It's that drilling down to look at the story the data's actually telling us. That to me is the intersectional bit that I'd like the system to perhaps do a bit better. Would you agree?
I would, and I would also then think about the whole thing about recruitment and then progression within the industry, because of course, and as a Black woman, Black female, former school leader, that trajectory was not smooth at all. Now, it's not smooth for anyone, so don't get me wrong. It's making out that everyone can just walk in and get jobs. It's tricky, and it's meant to be tricky. We're doing an important job, but the reality is, it is difficult, more difficult for Black female leaders, for women of colour in education to progress. And we need to know why. We need to know why that is, what's happening. So once you're in an organisation, what is actually happening for these particular, categories of staff that want to progress but are finding they're stopped, and maybe at an expense of another group. Definitely.
And my final question, because it is Black History Month, and we don't necessarily all condone that Black History Month needs to be celebrated. We want to move beyond Black History Month, but a lot of schools will be marking it. What would your call to action be for the schools to think about this intersectionality of role models and contributions to be celebrating during Black History Month in particular? I
think you said the word celebrating. I think actually maybe you start in October and you just continue. Just continue it. So to a certain extent, as I say, I'm always conflicted about Black History Month. I love it, but I hate it because I always think to myself, well, in August it was Black History Month. In September it happens all the time. It's living, and it doesn't always have to be about deficit. So I would say you're celebrating, and always celebrating from obviously the wider society, the world, etc., globally, but then also celebrate who you have within your own community. That's
the key point, isn't it? I've seen lots of tweets this week about that we need to stop celebrating Black American contributions and actually look at Black British contributions, and then think about Black gay contributions and Black disabled contributions, and make sure that we're actually expanding the visible role models we're actually presenting to our children during Black History Month as well. You're nodding away. That's agreement, Audrey?
I certainly am. Yeah, it's a hot topic for me. Yeah, definitely. And there's been some great programs actually. The BBC have been putting on some great programs. I think even on iPlayer now you can have Black British and Proud as a great documentary series. I think a 3 or 4 parter talking all about the amazing Black British contributions, Black British actors and artists that have made fantastic contributions. You know, don't want to denigrate our American friends, of course, amazing, but you know what? The talent's right here. It's right here, right now. So,
Indeed.
Yeah.
Audrey, thank you for waking up early for us. We do appreciate it. Thank you for opening the event. Go and enjoy the sunshine, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you very much.
Okay, so it's time for our next speaker. Really great to hear from Audrey. Following on from Audrey, we have Abid Ahmed, who is going to be talking to us about supporting young people and colleagues who stammer. So I'd like to welcome Abid into the studio. Morning.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So let's just start off with, I'll give you all about 30 to 45 seconds. Can you read the messages that you can see on the screen? And if you could type onto the YouTube chat how this makes you feel just by reading it. Okay, I'll give you about 15 more seconds. Okay, so I'm pretty sure that reading these messages makes you feel really sad and makes you feel really shocked at the fact that some of these things have taken place within a school setting and teachers have been on the other side. So what I'm going to do is talk about how you can support students and maybe your colleagues who stammer. So I'm a maths teacher, head of the department. I've been teaching now for 7 years, and I'm a person who stammers, and I've been stammering since the age of 4. What I would like to think is that I do now stammer with a lot more confidence instead. So it's really important that you know the facts about stammering. Now, it's a neurological condition that makes it physically hard to speak. It's also known as stuttering. It can have a negative effect on mental health. There's a lot of people that do feel suicidal about it. A lot of young people choose to hide their stammer because they're afraid, they're really embarrassed. Now, up to 8% of children will stammer at some point in their life. However, 1 to 3% will go on to stammer for the rest of their lives. Boys are 3 to 4 times more likely to stammer than girls. Stammering covers a wide spectrum. Everyone's stammer is different. Now, how do you identify, firstly, a child who stammers? So basically, someone who might sound like me. So you might hear like a repetition of sounds and words, stretching of sounds, blocking of sounds, so no sounds coming out of their mouth. That's what happens to me when I try and say my name. That's why I'd even start by talking about my name. Stopping or pausing mid-sentence, tapping on the table to get a rhythm of speech. These are some of the things that some children might do. What you might see is facial tension around them mouth when they're trying to speak, replacing words that they get stuck on. We're very good at it. We are an expert in the thesaurus. They may show signs of a reserved personality. Now, these are the do's and don'ts when speaking to a child who stammer. Don't interrupt their sentences. Don't finish off their sentences. Don't advise them on how to speak fluently. However, if you are working with a very, very young child, like someone who's 3 to 4, 5 years old, of course, what you might want to say to them is, okay, slow down. Take a breather. Do you want to come back and try again? Of course, the more older the children get, I wouldn't do that because they know they will know how to try and manage their own stammer. Don't make jokes about stammering. Don't treat them differently in front of the peers. Of course, we do have to make adjustments for children, but don't make it too obvious. Now, children who stammer, they will find it hard to make eye contact, and that's okay. Don't punish them for it. What you can do is, of course, try and maintain your eye contact. Always encourage them privately, and praise them publicly. Always give them time to speak. Now, I'll come back to that. Now, this is the main slide that I've made for teachers. Now, reasonable adjustments that you can make. Speak to your students to find out what they are comfortable with. You will realize that majority of them will be okay with the tasks that you do. Give all your children 30 seconds thinking time before cold calling. I'm a big fan of cold calling, but a good teaching and learning technique is, maybe you might want to say, okay, guys, I am going to choose someone from this room. However, I'm going to give you the question first, and I'm going to give you 22 seconds think time. What are the factors of 35? Think and then choose. At least that way you're giving someone, a child who stammers, a bit of time to really think. If you put them on the spot, they might struggle. Don't measure success by expecting quick responses. I'm a maths teacher, so I don't expect kids, well, apparently I should be expecting kids to know the timetables just like that. What harm does it do if it takes them a few seconds? Does it really matter? Always give students 25% extra time doing oral tasks. This is advised by exam boards. So if they're doing a presentation, give them that time. Avoid high pressure situations like icebreakers. At the start of the year, please don't get all your kids to stand up and talk about themselves. If I told you all to unmute yourself, to put your cameras on, talk to me about yourself, you'd hate it. Students are no different. Okay, what you can do instead is give every child a post-it note, tell them to write something down, and you can maybe read it. That's so much better. And I don't buy the thing where staff say, but we're trying to increase their confidence. You doing an icebreaker and to get them to stand up is probably not going to increase their confidence. I think confidence should be seen as a whole school thing, and school should be doing as a whole school thing, and not just you doing your lesson. Now, attend to your students more when circulating around the room, because they might struggle to put up their hands. Biggest one, and in fact, this was spoken a lot on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, but I've always been a fan of it, and I have made it compulsory within my department that every lesson there should be mini whiteboards on the table, not just for children who stammer, but for all children. It's the best, the most fastest, effective way to get answers from your students. However, you need to use mini whiteboards effectively and not use it for the sake of it. Okay. Now, do allow alternative responses to the register if they struggle to say yes, sir, or yes, miss. Now, as a whole school, what can you do? The Senko should hopefully be raising awareness of stammering amongst staff. If you're not too comfortable, please speak to me. I'm more than happy to provide some training for free. Educate your staff on reasonable adjustments that can be made, and make staff aware of the register that has all your send students, and especially the students with speech and language communication needs. Continue to educate your children about equality, diversity, disability, and making it normal to accept that there are many of us who are different. Create a confidence building group. Now, this doesn't just need to be for children who stammer. It could be for like any of your children. So I'm a big fan of trying to increase a child's confidence first, rather than going into techniques about how to improve your stammer. Employ speech and language therapists. Seek support from stammering related charities. And of course, so I'm stammering a lot more here. Celebrate International Stammering Awareness Day on the 22nd of October. Now, these are true responses of children who stammer that said that they wish their teacher knew. So I wish that my teacher knew that some days I really don't want to talk, and that's okay. Some days I really dislike reading out loud in front of a class. You might want to get them in smaller groups, or you might just want to wait until they're ready. Sometimes I wish that my teacher knew that tiredness makes me stammer more. It does. So look out for period 1 and the last period of the day. They are more likely to stammer. Okay. I really wish that my teacher knew that some children make fun of my stammer. I really wish that my teacher knew that I have so much to say, but I'm too embarrassed. Get your whiteboards out then. I wish my teacher knew that I really dislike when people finish my sentences, when people put me on the spot. Stammering makes me feel emotionally and physically tired. I can't explain to you how right now I'm feeling really physically drained because it just takes so much out of my body speaking for a long period of time. I don't know what I was thinking going into teaching, but I do love my job. That's a couple of more slides that I think that you might find interesting. So I have made a couple for children as well. Like, do you have a friend who stammers? And if so, continue being a good friend. Ask them how they are if they look upset. Don't make jokes about stammering. Tell the teacher if your friend is being bullied. Don't interrupt the sentences. Give them time to speak. Help your friend if they need it. Don't treat them differently. And this can apply to your colleagues as well. If someone in this stream is a person who stammers, stammer with confidence and a smile on your face. Be proud of who you are. Try your best in everything that you do. Never give up on your dreams. Talk to your friends about stammering. Tell your teacher about what you're comfortable with. Tell your teacher how they can support you. Tell your teacher if someone is pulling you. Now, just to finish off, I do provide free support online once a month on a Sunday. It's purely just confidence building activities. Parents must attend with the child, and they do have to register. I do also provide one during school time. So if you're a Senko or if you're a teacher with a child who stammers, please speak to your Senko and say that there's a teacher out there who's willing to do free support sessions during school time nationally. I hope that you have learned something new. Feel free to follow me on Twitter, which is stammer_teacher. Thank you.
Hey, Abed, I always love listening to you, and I've had the privilege of listening to you a few times now, and I always learn lots, and you've got lots of lovely comments about your fantastic slides and resources and the generosity in which you share. My first observation is that we didn't make a reasonable adjustment for you today with your slot, and we could have given you a little bit of extra time. So I'm sat here reflecting on you challenging us as teachers about the time we give to children. But as an event organizer, you're making me think about, actually, I should have checked, did you want a little bit longer for your own presentation? So thank you for challenging me there and how we curate these events, firstly.
It's totally fine, and I've done these so many times. I've mastered 10 minutes.
You have, I know, you've got it nailed down, but I think it's good to constantly being challenged around how we can be accessible and inclusive for the adults as well. And something I noticed in you, that I had a speech impediment as a child, that I speak quickly to mask my speech impediment. And when I can hear you picking up speed during the presentation, is that how you kind of you manage it, that you get into that rhythm, and that's how you get that flow when you are communicating?
So it's probably totally opposite. The only reason why I've been picking up speed, of course, two things: because I was aware of the time, and and because I've done this so many times, it's so ingrained into my mind that I know what I need to say. But this was a totally different presentation. There's no chance that I would have been able to speak as fast and maybe as fluently in certain times, which just shows that stammering, it does. It's totally random. Some days you might be fluent more than other days, and some days you might be disfluent more than other days.
Do we know why? You said about more boys than girls being diagnosed with stammering and stuttering. Do we know why that is? Why do more boys suffer from it? So
there is no official reason why, but we do know that stammering is down to how your brain is wired during the speech part, and unfortunately it just seems to be a lot more common in boys. However, we do know that statistically girls are better at masking disabilities and hiding a bit of it until they get a bit more older. So that could be a possible factor, but it's just like any other I'm pretty sure for autism, it's a very similar stat that boys are 3 to 4 times more likely to have autism as well. So we're not exactly too sure why.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And we've got Lizzie talking at the end of the event today about girls and autism in particular, so she might pick some of that up. And my other question is about you, when you went through your teacher training, what kind of support did you get? You said how did I end up being a teacher where I have to talk all day? It's exhausting. But what about the actual training pathway you took? Was there good support there for you?
So I think I was really good at masking it sometimes, and at that point in my life, I was still not comfortable with talking about my stammer so like openly. But I do know that if I did request support, that my university would have been very supportive. I can just give you a quick story as well. Just before, when I applied for my first teacher training, which was at the university that I studied in, and I assumed because I'm a student there, and I should get a bit of favoritism and get in. But I didn't, and I remember that day was about 5-6 hours of just so many things, and I did get rejected like literally 30 minutes after leaving. And the reason why I'm telling this story is at the start of last year, I got a call from that same PGCE mentor, and to be honest, all these years I did blame my stammer for that day, but of course that's not the reason why they said that they rejected me. And he got in contact with me, the same guy that did reject me, and he said, Abed, I've got a student who's a very similar like you, a young male, not young at the moment, but stammers, and I want to support him this time. And I kind of figured out, I think he probably did think that I couldn't do it last time because of my stammer, and he did actually apologize. He goes, I should have given you that chance, but I didn't really know much about stammering, but now I do. Can you support this young man and take him into your department? And I went to my head teacher and I wanted to get him in, but we were full. But I am trying to support that person as well at the moment.
I think that's a great challenge for everyone listening about the fact that we need to be really mindful that we don't make assumptions about people's abilities. And this comes up in a lot of different ways, isn't it, with people with disabilities, that actually we need, like you need to be asked whether you had the capacity to do that, not for someone to assume that you didn't. And I think that comes up a lot. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Really, really great to hear from you. So we encourage you to follow Abed on Twitter. He's got a brilliant website, loads and loads of free resources. Please do go in and find them and share them with your Senko. And just think about how you're supporting the pupils and the staff who stammer within your school context. So go and enjoy your Saturday, Abed, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. Bye.
Okay, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Abed, for joining us. Next, we have Nicky Bright, who will be talking to us about goals for raising menopause awareness. And I'm really pleased that this topic has come up. I work with a lot of women going through the menopause, so I'm really looking forward to it. Morning, Nicky. Oh, Nicky, you're on mute, Nicky.
Yes, thanks ever so much, Bennie. Yeah, it's the one certainty that we all have. Not all of us will get pregnant, but all of us will go through the menopause at some point or another. So that's one reason why it's really important, I think, to raise awareness of the menopause, and why I've been doing the work that I have been doing. So there's various other reasons. I'm just going to show you a slide that sort of identifies why this is so very important. As I've said, every woman will go through the menopause at some point, and this is the fastest growing demographic in the workplace, and even more of us are in leadership positions. So it's important to be able to manage that when we are leading, as well as knowing more about it so we can lead others. And 25%, a quarter of women consider leaving the workplace because of the symptoms and managing their symptoms. And 12% actually do leave the workplace. And I want to raise, one of my goals is to raise awareness to allow women to have more financial independence. Of course, women don't make so many pensions contributions when they take time out to have children, but it's a double whammy if we also leave work earlier than we might do otherwise, because we're not feeling like we're coping with those menopause symptoms. So, that has a financial implication for women, their families, their communities. And I want to help women, have more financial independence and choice over what it is that they want to do with their future. So I'm just going to drop that slide now, but I hope that's outlined to you why that's so very, very important. And I think there's a key difference between understanding between menopause and perimenopause. Certainly when I went through the menopause, or perimenopause, I was thinking, well, I'm too young for this. Menopause happens when you're 50s and sort of later on. And what you don't realize is that although the average age for menopause is 45, between 45 and 55, and within that, the average age is 51. The perimenopause is the period before you go through the menopause. And the perimenopause can last between 4 to 6 years or longer indeed. So that means that if your menopause is starting at age, or you go through the menopause at 45, that potentially you can be starting your perimenopause in your late 30s, early 40s as well. So one of my goals is to make sure that women realise that they may well be going through the perimenopause during their 40s, and for them to get some support during that time. Partly because some women find that their symptoms are even worse and more difficult to manage during the perimenopause than menopause. And this is the age as well, 45 to 55, when actually potentially there's a perfect storm with menopausal symptoms, and it's the highest rate of suicide in women at this age as well. So there's a really strong imperative to support women through their symptoms. So your perimenopausal symptoms might start in your early 40s, as I've said, and the symptoms can last a long time. Some women find that their menopausal symptoms continue for the rest of their lives. About 1 in 100 women find that, and getting some support for those symptoms is important. About a quarter of women say that their symptoms are really severe, and a quarter of women go through the menopause and their symptoms are fine and they manage perfectly well. About a third of women find that their symptoms are quite severe and debilitating. And then there's everybody in between. And I think it's really important that those women understand sufficiently not to just soldier on, but also to make changes in their lifestyle and so on, that will help them to improve the quality of their life, the way that they're managing those symptoms, and therefore, as I say, potentially, if they want to, continue to work and therefore have that financial independence and choice over what they do with their lives, rather than relying on their family and friends and communities and so on. And each woman has an individual cocktail of over 40 symptoms. And those 40 symptoms can range from things that are seemingly small, like itchy skin and so on, although that's quite debilitating if you can feel like your flesh is creeping, to the classic symptoms of hot flushes and brain fog and mood swings and so on. Many women are wrongly diagnosed with depression and given antidepressants when hormone replacement therapy, which is much better than it used to be, can alleviate the symptoms. And the nice guidelines are that for women, the HRT should be the first line to see whether hormones and balancing out hormones better helps women. Of course, there's women for whom antidepressants are absolutely right and proper, but many are misdiagnosed. So I've got some goals. It's not just my goals. These are goals of some menopause awareness campaigns. So I'm just going to show you a slide now with those goals for increasing awareness. So there's 3 sort of campaigns. Make Menopause Matter, run by Diane Danzebrink. She's got a online petition for people to sign to raise awareness. There's the Menopause Revolution, which is something that was a cross-party campaign that was set up by Carolyn Harris, who is the MP for Swansea, but it's got cross-party support. And there's a new campaign, the Menopause Mandate, which she has, the sort of Menopause Revolution has morphed into a Menopause Mandate. And this is in Parliament Square last year. You can just about make me out at the back there. The 3 goals, which are really important to me, and I hope should be important to everybody else, are that all GPs and healthcare professionals should receive medical training. It's not compulsory part of the GP curriculum, unbelievably. And so, more GPs and healthcare professionals need to receive this mandatory menopause training. And you will have heard in the news this week that, there's people talking about the need for a menopause check at 45. Yes, absolutely, it certainly would be helpful to do that. But actually, why don't we, rather than having a specific thing, why don't we, most people have their smear tests and so on. why don't we make sure that everybody in the healthcare professionals and GPs knows about menopause so that they can talk about it at normal routine appointments that are already existing rather than creating something new. Anyway, the second goal is to increase awareness and guidance in the workplace. And that's something that I do regularly, going into schools and different companies across the country to raise awareness around menopause. I started at the Girls' Schools Association Heads Conference in 2019, and now, going to lots of different schools talking about raising awareness for not just women, for men as well, to understand what their partners and so on are going through. And also age-appropriate education on menopause in the RSE curriculum. It is in the RSE curriculum to be taught, but there's, obviously work to be done in making sure that happens and that it's revisited in a sort of spiral curriculum. So those are the those campaign goals, and to support those, I've got my own goals on my next slide. My own goals are that, everybody knows about the menopause. Everybody is therefore supported to continue to work, to maintain or gain their financial independence in their later years. And for me, it's perimenopause and the understanding of perimenopause that's so very important in that, because that's where people start to have some real difficulties with managing their symptoms. I also, aim to help more relationships potentially survive perimenopause by increasing awareness with men and women. And Law Menopause talks a lot about how menopause impacts women with their divorce settlements and so on, and how it has an impact. So we've got relationship difficulties, we've got mental health difficulties, and so on, all of which we can support ourselves even better with a bit more awareness. And my ultimate aim is that more women basically have more choice over their lives because they understand what's going on for them. Because in my day, your cycles and your periods were talked about in terms of not getting pregnant and then they stop. And so, too many women don't know what's happening to them and what's going to happen to them. So those are my goals, really, and the goals I hope that you would share as well in terms of increasing menopause awareness. And I just want to signpost you to the Menopause Awareness Toolkit that I put together with Sarah Davies of Talking Menopause for diverse educators. It's there, it's well used, and it's useful because the resources are teacher focused, education focused. And I'd also like to direct you towards the Newson Health, both the Balanced Menopause app to track your symptoms in the same way that you might track on a period tracker, and also loads of great leaflets for partners as well as women about perimenopause and menopause and different conditions. And, if you think that you've got can't take HRT because of breast cancer, finding out more about what's possible now with this more modern HRT. So whistle stop tour around my goals for menopause there, and I hope that is really helpful to everybody in terms of increasing menopause awareness so that we can reach those goals.
So super helpful. I've listened to you so many times now talk about the menopause, and I learned something new every time. And it was lovely to meet you in person this week as well for the first time. Twitter friends finally meeting in real time. And I was going to ask you about the app because I know we've talked about this about. I'm in that group. I'm in my early 40s, and I wouldn't necessarily say I was going through the perimenopause, but when you begin to track all the different things, you might get that pattern. So this app is a way for you to perhaps bring together lots of little elements that you don't see as being that bigger picture.
Absolutely. And I wish that it had been around when I was going through my perimenopause, because it would have put things together. Of course, our hormones fluctuate, so the symptoms come and go. So you sort of think, oh, that's odd, and then it goes, and you don't think about it. And then, oh, that's odd, something else. So this pulls everything together. You can see the monthly fluctuations. And a friend of mine said it's really, really useful because you can actually see when things are coming and going, when they're more severe and not. And so what you can do then is you can actually print it off, download it, and take it to your healthcare professional and say, this is my pattern, and therefore I would like to try X, Y, or Z. So it means that you've got evidence, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
Particularly when you've got a doctor who's not listening, or a doctor who
Yeah.
hasn't had that training, isn't
Hasn't
aware.
had- yeah.
Because yeah, I've got so many girlfriends, and I've seen it on Twitter all the time with women in our network who are going to the doctors, but they're being gaslit really and told
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with them and being pushed
Yeah.
back.
You're too young to go through the menopause because you're not 45 yet. Well, yes,
Yeah.
I am. Look, it should be symptoms led. Ignore the stuff about blood tests. News and Health say, you know, follow the symptoms. It's the symptoms that lead. You might have blood tests later to see what's happened with your levels. And if you're very early on, you know, potentially you'll have blood tests then. But for you know, usually actually it should be symptoms led, the diagnosis.
Absolutely. And if we take it to the workplace, then we've got lots of school leaders on the call, head teachers, people with the power to perhaps look at this idea of a menopause awareness policy. What are the kind of things that you'd like to see? What are your goals for schools? What could schools be doing?
Yeah, goals for schools are that people, you know, support women going through the menopause, and that doesn't. You don't need a specific menopause policy, although it does help. There should at least be guidance on the menopause in a wellbeing policy, so that there's something specific. But you can't. It won't be a one size fits all policy, because with the over 40 symptoms and each woman having their own individual cocktail, this is why the trackers are so very important, because you might have itchy skin, and another friend had bad breath, and then another friend, you know, had heart palpitations. So it varies so much from woman to woman that you can't just say, oh, I'll give you the perimenopause, menopause reasonable adjustments list, because actually they need to be tailored to you, and you know, you need to take control yourself as well in terms of managing your lifestyle and you know, getting the support that you need.
But it's also, I guess, knowing what are those reasonable adjustments that we can make in the workplace. For example, are there rooms with air conditioning? Some rooms have, some rooms haven't got. And I think about flexible working as well. And like, it might not be a cited reason for why people want flexible working, but it could be an underlying reason why people do want to work flexibly.
Indeed. You know, coming in a little bit later because you have been up all night, you know, quite often you'll get heart palpitations at 3-4 in the morning, be awake for an hour and a half and then sleep. And we all know that, you know, then you feel dead. So actually being able to come in a bit later, or rest areas within schools where, you know, in a break you could go and, you know, just have a snooze. I know that's sort of anathema in schools really, but actually it would really help you then keep yourself going.
More Google and Facebook than schools, but why not? I mean, let's disrupt things here. Absolutely. And my final question, going back to the curriculum, because I know we've talked about this before. I mean, where would you see it sitting? Like Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5, RSHE lessons? Where do you think, where's age appropriate for us to be learning about the menopause, do you think?
I think it has to keep, we have to keep coming back to it, spiral curriculum, because, you know, what if a child is away on that one day when you give them the 1 hour of menopause? You know, that's no good either. It needs to be a constant communication, a constant conversation. And I think it's perfectly possible to say to, you know, younger students in Key Stage 2, you know, your hormones change throughout. You know, you sometimes you get wonky hormones, and actually, you know, when you get older, your hormones might be wonky, and you know, and then you come back to it later on. So I think it's appropriate for quite young children, actually.
Final point, because I know we've talked about the wonky hormones before, and about the concoction of having a mother going through the menopause and a teen going through hormones in the same household. That can be quite catastrophic, can't it?
Absolutely. And I think school leaders see that, and school teachers see that all the time, don't they? Without necessarily realizing it, but it can be really helpful. And there's some really great people out there doing some work. Joe Wetherall, for example, supporting women with teenagers who are going through the menopause themselves. So, recognize it in those around, and, you know, offer support as well. So
brilliant. Nicky, thank you so much for joining us. Lovely to see you and listen to you as always. We're going to take a short break now, so please go and put the kettle on, get yourself a drink. We'll be back at 10 o'clock with our next 3 speakers. Happy Saturday, Nicky. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our 9th virtual Diverse Ed event. Thank you to our speakers in part 1. We are now moving into part 2 with 3 more speakers. I'll be doing the introductions this time, and Bennie will be doing the Q&A. So first speaker in part 2 is the lovely Lisa Panford, who is going to be talking about diversifying the MFL curriculum. Good morning, Lisa.
Morning, Hannah. You hear me okay?
I'm really good, sweetheart. Looking forward to listening to you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to have been asked to join the discussions today. I'd like to begin by centering race in this discussion around diversifying the modern foreign languages curriculum. And whilst I acknowledge the limitations of a colour-only approach to understanding any issue because of the multiple interactions between race, gender, class, faith, disability, poverty, sexuality, age, so on and so forth. Audrey Pantelis spoke to that incredibly this morning. There are also lots of really much needed advancements in other dimensions, like gender inclusive language in the MFL classroom. My present concern is with drawing attention to an area which remains underexplored in my subject. There's been until now a entirely colourblind approach to pedagogy and policy in modern foreign languages, and that's reflected by the gaping absence of research and critical engagement around race in our specific MFL secondary domain. Before I begin to talk about the secondary curriculum, which is the reason I'm here, I'll start with a bit of a disclaimer, and that's my positionality with regards to race and racism in MFL. It's a legitimate area of scrutiny because any work in this area of race and racism in MFL, for me, is both professional and deeply personal. And I want to be transparent about the fact that my work and approaches are informed by my personal and professional experiences. I'm also really unashamedly motivated by my conviction that we need to a broader debate on counteracting what I find to be racially discriminatory practices in our subjects and in MFL specifically. Previously, I've written about my personal interactions with our subject, not to speak for all Black teachers and all Black learners of MFL, but rather to show how by theorising race within the context of my own experience has helped me to make sense of my practice and life as a Black learner of languages, a Black teacher of languages, and now a Black teacher educator of languages. And so I draw on my nearly 40 years of lived experience as a Black woman in the UK, the majority of which has been spent in languages education, studying languages in mainstream secondary, higher education, to tell me that our language classrooms, languages education, languages lessons, language curricula, none of these are racially neutral spaces. And I understand my own experiences as a pupil and teacher of languages in the context of wider institutional and structural systems in which we operate. And I find that various policy and curriculum decisions have conspired to effectively provide barriers for people who look like me to see themselves within our subject. I believe that current approaches and practices undermine the brilliantly transformative and liberatory potential of learning a language. And I believe in the need to amplify conversations around race and racism, and that an anti-racist and decolonized intervention is needed in order to realise what the Department for Education have themselves defined as the purpose of studying a language, which is an liberation from insularity and an opening to other cultures to foster people's curiosity and deepen their understanding of the world. So that's my disclaimer. Over 2 decades ago, when I was a teenager and left secondary school with A-levels in French and Spanish, I had then only a kind of vague notion of the wider French and Spanish speaking world. So a few tokenistic anecdotes about Latin American festivals. And to be honest, I was under the utterly ludicrous impression as I began my university studies, not incidentally as the only Black languages honours student, that I was quite a unique speciality as a Black speaker of French and Spanish. Entirely ludicrous, of course, when you consider the fact that the majority of Spanish and French speakers are global majority and live outside of Europe. Notwithstanding that, I feel like this misconception could really well endure in our pupils 2 decades on today. And you might ask how. I would say beyond the very grave issue, not beyond, one very seriously grave issue is around teacher diversity, and I think that's disproportionately stark in our subject. It's captured in the NFER report recently. There's the fact that even the name and the positioning of our subject as modern foreign languages entrenches some artificial and harmful dichotomization between usually French, German, and Spanish on the one hand, and so-called community languages or heritage language or home languages, which are kind of sidestepped and othered. Our curricula, which is the focus here, is driven by the outcomes, of course, presented in the GCSE and A-level subject criteria, and they both fail dismally to explore the rich socio-cultural, historic, and political dimensions of our subject. Colonial underpinnings and legacies of French, Spanish, and to a lesser extent German continue to be unexplored. European literary texts continue to be centred by A-level exam boards. Eurocentric cultural examples are proffered. And while there's been significant recent efforts, and I'm aware of Pearson and Oxford University's Press, their work in this area, stereotypical and tokenistic representation of the global South continue to be commonplace in current textbooks, and as is visible on this slide. Black narratives were, back when I was a secondary student in the 90s, and today, virtually non-existent. And where they are present, they're consigned to areas of festivals, immigration, or poverty, as seen here. And that perpetuates essentialist, reductionist, and harmful misconceptions about the world. While the events in recent years, in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, meant that there's been a sort of renewed emphasis, albeit well-intentioned, and a renewed commitment to diversifying the MFL curricula. Our community is absolutely awash with hashtag promoting diversity in MFL. A growing number of practitioners, myself included, find curriculum developments centering diversification approaches wanting in our subject and often missing the mark. They're inadequate. In short, when we're talking about diversification in the context of MFL, we are referring to sort of well-meaning gestures that we may engage in to feel good about our lessons. So easy wins like showcasing Black French sports personality like Drogba, or doing a Day of the Dead display, and feel like our work is done. We find this approach wanting and problematic because of what it conceals and fails to address. What it conceals is an assumed neutral or normalized point, which is the white, the European, relative to which all others become diverse. And what it fails to address is race. So it's well intended, but it's also become how we talk about race in the classroom when we can't talk about race because it seems more polite and positive. So we can comfortably talk about the lack of diversity in the MFL curriculum where we can't speak of racism in the MFL curriculum. And I would posit that celebrating diversity with occasional references to Drogba, Day of the Dead, and Djibouti does nothing deep to address the real concerns about racialized inequalities that are perpetuated by our curricula. On the contrary, one of the aspects that I find so hopeful about the decolonized agenda is the way that it explicitly addresses race, power, marginalization by forcing us to counter and disrupt dominant narratives. And I think that's how we begin this sort of radical process of unraveling our children and ourselves with them from what Jeffrey Barchi describes as the labyrinthine paradigms of power and privilege. Because it's helpful to have a theoretical framework to refer to. Broadly speaking, what I'm drawing on here are the tenets of critical race pedagogy. I think the work begins with looking within ourselves and our subjects. So exposing issues of racism is uncomfortable and unpopular in most places. Maybe it's extra uncomfortable in the field of languages education, because by nature, I think it attracts people who have had international experiences and a willingness, often even a passion for intercultural understanding sharing cultural insights to enrich learners' lives. But it doesn't make our field or our practitioners devoid of the responsibility to examine how racism or any other injustices influence our practice or ourselves. One space dedicated to explore the issues of race and racism and how it shows up within our subject is our Decolonising Secondary MFL Special Interest Group, it's a bit of a mouthful. Our members who are practitioners in schools, universities, and educational publishing and awarding bodies. So this group was founded by me and my colleague Melina Irvin, who's a teacher based in Bristol over a year ago now. And I'll be honest, the precise shape of how this collaboration develops, we don't know yet. But we're really excited to be working across sectors with professionals who have committed to how we might collaboratively mobilise in the area of decolonising secondary MFL. Here we've got a space to explore our blind spots as language practitioners. Like, do we have assumptions around our own perceptions of our international outlook? To work collectively to think about how we might contribute to supporting teachers to be more confidently competent to take action in anti-racist and decolonised practices in MFL. We're discussing ways that we might work collaboratively with colleagues from other subjects, history, English. We know this work is being done by colleagues in different subjects. So, and there's a forthcoming article for BERA, I know, that's edited by Tara Glowich, who captures this sort of teacher-led decolonising and anti-racist work.
So I'm going to stop you there, Lisa, just because we've got to make sure we're going on time here. It is absolutely fascinating and has certainly made me think really deeply about this, because when I've been working on diversity in the curriculum, you know, we often talk about representation in MFL. And one of the things that comes back, you know, as it does in a lot of subjects, is, well, actually, we are so busy teaching the grammar, we are so busy teaching the vocabulary. What is the point? What is the purpose in ensuring that there is this exploration of, you know, race and racism in the MFL curriculum? That's the provocation. What do you think?
I think it kind of comes back to this idea of what's the purpose of studying a language. And if we subscribe to the Department for Education that it's a liberation from insularity, then it goes way beyond linguistic structures and chunking of language. I think it's disingenuous for me to not acknowledge the fact that languages teachers, all teachers, but languages teachers currently are under huge pressure. Currently, the GCSE is being revised, so we're under huge pressure. And you know, I'm not suggesting that the onus should be placed on individual practitioners, kind of, you know, tear up resources and start again and design a decolonized curriculum. But I am suggesting that they're welcome to join us in the Decolonized Special Interest Group and explore ways that we can work collaboratively to improve the quality of languages education for all our pupils. And I really see this as I really see this work as about improving the quality of education. Sorry, for all our pupils.
Oh, brilliant! We've got a guest. I absolutely agree. And one of the things that is so important is to remember this, that things don't exist in a vacuum, and that with whichever subject you teach, there is a context, there is a history, you know, like you talked about the colonial legacy of MFL. And how do teachers, we've got about a minute left, so how do teachers go about, apart from joining you, where do they go to find out what they don't know?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is a really, I mean, there's been lots of work in higher education around, you know, around by a new generation of academics who are exploring Black narratives in languages. But there is a bit of a disconnect here between that and practice. I would always suggest that decolonizing work, anti-racist work, starts from looking within and interrogating your own practice. It's not about attacking anyone's identity. This is about looking within and seeing how racism may show up in you, show up in yourself, in your own classroom. And sort of I heard you speak, Bennie, and our colleague Shona Reed speak about leaning into the discomfort. And I don't think there is a that really resonated with me, this idea of leaning into the discomfort. I don't think there is a meaningful way to work in an anti-racist and decolonizing way without acknowledging, without having some integrity about it, and acknowledging the fact that this is going to cause discomfort.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lisa. I could listen to you all day. I'm sure we will catch up at some point to discuss this further. I do have to go to our next speaker though, but thank you so much.
Our next speaker in part 2 is another one of our contributors from the book. First of all, I'm getting to meet Allison Zionts in person, if we call this in person. And please tell me if I've pronounced your last name wrong there, Allison. It's lovely to see you. And I think you're going to build on what Lisa said with this idea of how you bring yourself to the classroom and use yourself as a living resource. So I'm really excited to hear you speak.
Hi, good morning. I'm very excited to be here. You did pronounce my last name correctly. And I am very excited to be following from Lisa and building on to being that resource in the classroom. So I'm just going to share my slides really quickly. Thank you. So I'm speaking about becoming this living resource for the classroom. And the first thing I want to do is that positionality. And who am I really when we're looking into this? Like many people here, I'm a teacher. I'm also a student. I'm a PhD student. I'm an immigrant, and I'm quite proudly an immigrant of someone who's moved to this country, of generations of family who have had to move and bounce around. I'm a Jewish woman, which is what I'm going to be speaking about mostly today. I'm part of the queer community. I'm a vegan. I'm a volunteer, and I'm also at many points in time a resource. I also quite like this picture was chosen by my students yesterday because they said nothing captures me more than what looks like me just hanging out in a library looking like a geeky teacher. So I thought I would share that one. I'm speaking about today, I have 2 images on the screen because when I started working in British schools, I would occasionally drop into my lessons that small bits about myself, including the fact that I was Jewish. It would also and often be followed up with curious minds, and occasionally I would have to correct some misconceptions they had around people who are Jewish. And sometimes these misconceptions were really innocent, and sometimes they were full-blown anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that they had parroted from either an online source or in some cases what they had heard from families or even previous schools. These were from students that I taught personally, who I felt very comfortable with, and our conversations were always supportive and always fruitful, and I never regretted having a single one. I have 2 images on the screen right now, one representing Holocaust Memorial Day, and another a painting portraying a scene from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, which is going to be quite a theme today. Outside of religious education lessons, these tend to be the only times that Jews are really brought up within the national curriculum or the standard school year. As the only Jewish teacher in most of the schools I've taught in, and in most cases the only Jewish person, this means that I become someone that students I don't even teach start to talk about or whisper about. Suddenly, the simple fact that I'm Jewish falls into one of 2 categories. Either I come from a line of victims, as we see with Holocaust Memorial Day, or I could come from a line of villains, as might be portrayed in their English lessons. Young people will then struggle to separate me from these 2 categories. And it's really about what we can do to help build that in, to make sure they understand that diversity within. So within academic writing, what I do is often referred to as being this authentic resource. It's not just about being yourself, because as we know, teachers have to be that professional space within their classroom, remaining apolitical. But it's around how teachers can model who they are and being open enough about their personal characteristics and how they might incorporate these characteristics into their lessons. There's no one way to do this. There's no roadmap. And it's really about the boundaries that teachers feel comfortable setting for themselves, as well as making sure that they are supported within the schools. One thing I really want to bring up is that staff can't be can't be forced at any point to sharing their identities or sharing their stories with students. For a number of reasons, they may not feel safe doing so. It may not fit their style of teaching, their own pedagogy, but it's around creating this culture where it's acceptable to do that, where staff and students can authentically be themselves, share who they are, and that the school can invest within this as a way of enriching education, enriching cultural capital. We live within contemporary British society. Students are surrounded by millions of people who are both similar to them and dissimilar to them. And being authentic is just one way that we can allow students to explore these characteristics in our society within a controlled and safer space. Doing this, though, we do need to keep in mind that it needs to be embedded, it needs to be part of the school culture, and that we also need to make sure we put in safeguards in place for the students who will want to explore and get involved and show who they are, and they need to be supported as well. Around 6 years ago, one of the deputy head teachers at my school and I were talking about the Merchant of Venice, and she knew that I had really strong feelings about exposure of Jews within the national curriculum. And she asked if I would come in just for a quick 5 minutes to do a Q&A with her year nines and give them some context around Jewish life, and I wholeheartedly agreed. Those 5 minutes led to a full hour. The students were incredibly engaged and they had so many questions, and they were grateful that I was giving them space to ask these questions. I made a really strong rule at the beginning about the fact that they can ask a question and I will assume it comes from a place of good intent. So if they're asking something that could come across as hurtful, I'll explain to them why it comes across as hurtful, but then answer their question. And I didn't want them to feel like they couldn't ask a question, maybe their only time being able to ask a question to someone they knew of as Jewish, with them feeling stopped in that situation. Since that point, I've been invited to share and speak in every Year 9 English class within the summer term as they read this text. So over the last 6 years, I have spoken to 50 classes of Year 9 students within my school. And it's a way of providing them with context, but also providing them with another face, another experience of what a Jewish person could look like or what a Jewish person has gone through. It's broadened their understanding of Jews, but also made many students from other marginalized backgrounds start to feel comfortable picking holes within the curriculum, start to say, actually, we talk about people from my country in this book, but actually that's not been my experience. Can I share my experience? Can I enrich the lives of my students? Because they start to see themselves as that resource. It makes our classrooms and our schools much richer places, and it's one where our students can become to feel more prepared and more empowered to be who they really are. For the last year, and I know Bennie is going to be quite pleased having this on the screen, our schools incorporated reading Bennie's book on diversity in schools as part of our CPD. And as we read this, it's not just everybody read a chapter, all right, have 5 minutes to discuss, now let's move on. It's really talking about how do we embed this. From reading this book and from some of our experiences, staff have started sharing their experiences in front of whole staff meetings. So we've had colleagues stand up to speak about what it was like growing up as a Black Muslim student in a predominantly white non-Muslim area. We've had staff stand up and say, as a parent of a disabled child, here are things I experienced that I would like staff to know about. I was able to stand up and speak about anti-Semitism that I experienced in my own life and giving some of that context. And it allows staff to start to, again, recognize that diversity. But you cannot do this. And as we're thinking about goals today, I really don't want people to say, next week in staff meeting, I'm going to ask if anybody has something to share. It cannot happen without that strong foundation that these stories are going to be held, they're going to be listened to, and they're not going to be tokenistic. So I ask you, if we're setting some goals, to dedicate some time, some really valuable time, to breaking down what we can do to allow those staff and students to be themselves, to share their experiences, and to make sure those experiences never feel like a tick box, never feel like something we're just going to listen to, say, thank you, and move on from. How can they become more than distant memories or something in the ether? But how can we use this to build into our curriculum time to explore and engage with the real people living in our community and working in our schools? Thank you very much for listening to me. I think I spoke a little bit quickly, but I get very scared of running out of time.
Yeah, it was absolutely fascinating. And of course, yes, I recognized the book on the screen. So thank you for that. It's really interesting hearing you talk about yourself as a living resource. And I think it's wonderful for the children to be able to see that. My question comes from a point of kind of the mental workload of that. So, you know, being the representative for an entire, you know, religion of people, is that not wearying?
It absolutely can be, and I'm really glad you mentioned that. And that's why I think it actually needs to be built in. So I have regular line manager meetings, obviously with my line manager, and in that we do talk about when things come up, and I'm able to go and share with her and say, I'm having these conversations. Here's what I'm going to do to give myself time. So if I'm speaking to a year 9 class, I'm not going to go straight from there to my year 10 class. What can I do to build in a little bit of comfort time for me?
Mm.
And my school's really good at making sure that feels supported. If something comes up that actually is a little bit difficult or triggering, part of that being a living resource and being that authentic is saying to students and saying to staff,
Mm.
now's not the time I'm able to talk about this. And it also models that boundary setting for them.
Mm.
And I want students and staff themselves to not feel like just because somebody asks you, you have to give them an answer on the spot. You can say, now's not the time. I'm happy to talk about this after school.
Mm.
I'm happy to talk about this another day. Or actually, sometimes now's not the time, but here's somebody else I can recommend for you that's an online resource. And let's talk about it once you have a bit more groundwork.
Yeah.
And it's setting those boundaries and just being really confident. If I was having a really bad day, I would probably not do one of those talks to year 9s and say, I'd
Yeah.
actually rather, for my own well-being, move it to next Tuesday if we can. And staff are
So
really good around that.
I think that's very wise. I think kind of protecting ourselves, because there is an inherent vulnerability to being a living resource. What conditions had to be there in order for you to feel safe in the space, you know, at school, to be able to be this living resource?
I think the safety came from knowing when I was asked to speak. So when I was asked to speak about Merchant of Venice the first time, I was
Mm.
asked by someone who knew this was something I was passionate about and that I'd be comfortable doing. It was something very much a opt-in, not expected of.
Yeah.
And I think if we're again setting these goals, it's if you have marginalized staff who might be willing to speak, make sure they know this isn't something they're being forced to do. This is
Mm.
something that um, they need to know going into this. Here's what
Mm.
we're going to do. Here's how we're going to protect you. And not only that, here's how what you say is going to have an impact.
Yeah.
Tell them the value of this, because otherwise it's, please give us your emotional labor for nothing. Give us
Yeah.
your emotional labor, and here's how we're going to support you through that. And here's how your emotional labor and time is going to positively impact the students and those around you.
Yeah. And
And
it's
teachers
massively
have that moral background that I think many would
I
do.
think I hear that, and you know, when you talk about those conditions, I think safety is such a big consideration, because we know that anti-Semitism is still rife. We know that people will come with very insidious views, and quite often children will have misconceptions that, you know, you're going to face in any kind of question and answer session. Now, just kind of flipping this slightly, you know, there will be schools where there are no Jewish teachers, and so, you know, apart from shipping you to different parts of the country, you know, what can be done? Can you do this work? Can you be the living resource when you don't have the identity?
I think that's a lot more difficult. I think religious studies departments tend to do it very well. So when we think about that authentic living or authentic
Mm.
experiences, you might have a religious studies department in some schools of 1 or 2 people who have to now represent 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 religions, and they bring in their authentic resources by field trips,
Mm.
by bringing in artifacts and materials, and by having those around them and saying, I don't know all the answers. I can't tell you what it's like to live with this resource,
Mm.
but let's go to a place where people do, or let's listen to as many actual voices of people with these experiences as possible. And
Yeah.
I think if people are struggling for how they can incorporate this, talk to your RE departments,
Mm.
because they find ways to do this.
Absolutely. I still think we should just ship you to different parts of the country, and
I'd love that. That would be fun.
like we've got Alison. But no, thank you so much for sharing your experiences
Absolutely.
today. I'm so amazed by the work that you do, and I'm sure that the students are getting such a good deal out of it. So thank you, and please do stay in touch. It's so nice to meet you in person.
It's very exciting. Thank you very much for having me.
Take care.
And thank you so much. I took away so much from your talk there. And our third and final talk in part 2 in this kind of curriculum thread is from Rob Power, who's going to be talking about moving from local to global and thinking about how we create global curriculums that are totally inclusive. Good morning, Rob. It's lovely to meet you.
Good morning. Likewise. Likewise.
Over to you.
Right. Today, and I think for me, it's so important that we begin to promote sort of student activism and kind of student engagement in these debates and these discussions. And I hope you can see these slides that are coming up at the moment. But something that I found in surveying over 500 teachers over the course of my work with Powerful Histories is that there's a real kind of disconnect between, in many schools, what as educators we think we know best, and at the same time what kind of young people would like to see. I've got a couple of quotes here from quite dispiriting quotes, you know, from my perspective that I had when I first started out on this journey. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of talk through, you know, when we think about who should lead change and where change should come from, often we look to ourselves. And the project that I've been launching in a number of schools really focuses on how we can shift this activism really from ourselves and shift it to young people. Now, there are three things or three component parts to this local to global teaching project. Invariably, when we embrace debates and discussions around diversity within schools, it's about what we teach. And the first thing I observed from many staff was that school leaders tended to go to humanities or arts departments and say, what can you do to integrate non-white, non-Western modules into what you teach? And I couldn't help but feel that this is an unhelpful, and to be frank, a reaction to many of these really important debates and discussions that wasn't leading to lasting and meaningful change. So what we thought about doing in a number of schools is creating personalized engagement pathways for students so that we could inspire them to become activists and allies and appreciate that the communities in which they lived and worked were products of much broader global transactions. And part of that is not just exploring what we teach, but how we teach it. And I'm always minded to think of Audrey Lorde's quote, the master's tools and the master's house. If we are still delivering non-Western modules, for instance, but still using ostensibly Western pedagogies, then to what extent are we really beginning to meaningfully decolonize our learning spaces? So let me just share a little bit more about the three kind of components to the local to global project and the global kind of teaching project. Now, the local to global project is this much bigger cog in the wheel, which we want everything that we do moving forward to be led by young people, to be led by students, and then in component parts for teachers to be able to support and facilitate that as and when we're able to do so. We want to create curriculums which are responsive and reflect the lived realities and lived experiences of the worlds that young people live in. And ultimately, that is about celebrating stories that haven't perhaps featured in the curriculums of young people today. Now, the local to global project comprises three main parts. And we encourage students in the initial instance to look at their own class and their own community. And you see here from my first sort of much smaller orange circle that you have the students will talk about, they'll write 5 facts about themselves, and then they'll go and put those 5 facts, which might perhaps talk about where they were born, where they spent most of their younger years, and perhaps where they're living now, and they'll go and stick those on a map. And invariably, whether I'm in London or in Manchester or in Norfolk, those student experiences will not particularly be very diverse. They will, pretty much be relational to the areas in which the school is based. However, when we encourage young people to think about the broader stories and experiences from their own family, look at the global pattern that then begins to emerge, which isn't seen in that first kind of exercise. Now, I think this is interesting in itself to explore, and this is an example from a school in London. We want to promote critical interrogation of these global experiences. And I've highlighted here, for instance, that most of the students came from, or families and family stories and experiences came from former British Empire colonies. Now, to encourage students to think critically about that and about what that perhaps might tell them about their own unconscious biases is actually a really good starting point for further debate and discussion. From this point, we begin to think about the history of the school, history as how diverse perhaps that school history might be, and then expanding it out and looking at local communities. Now, again, here is an example from a school in London. And one of the things that we were able to identify from this journey, which started out at the local, i.e. the personal experiences of the student, and then began to expand to incorporate local communities, is that many of those students, despite living in an area of London which comprised a diversity of communities, many of those students were completely unaware that they lived in a community with one of the largest concentrations of Somali communities in the UK. From this point, what we were able to do is think about ways in which we might find, I always go back to that idea of listening to the silence or embracing the silence in order to consider the ways in which we can represent hidden stories and hidden experiences. After encouraging students to do so, something we did was to reflect and invite members of the Somali community into the school. And we interviewed, this is young people interviewing members of the Somali community. We interrogated data that has been released on that particular community and identified the challenges that the Somali community was facing. And what we were able to do is determine that the stories of the Somali community in the UK had been completely unrepresented. In order to make an impact, to personalize learning, to promote change in that regard, we asked students to become activists themselves. And images that we see here is when we gave students the opportunity to launch a social action campaign with an entire Year 9 group. That Year 9 group were then able to receive funding for a charity idea which could feed into the work of the Somali organisations that we invited in. So this is truly a local to global project, but it's also complemented by 2 other things. The first thing that we are encouraging staff to embrace some of the amazing and rich literature around pedagogy and writing, and to feed into this really exciting project. But we're also encouraging staff to think about global knowledge pathways. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there is simply no point in the inclusion of non-Western modules in curriculums unless we're going to consider, as Bell Hooks argues, non-Western knowledge acquisition. So the local to global project and the ways in which we can globalize our curriculums can perhaps be rooted very much in the local. We always encourage students that this is an opportunity to embrace conversation. This is their community, their future, and we want to make sure that their voice is heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. It was really interesting listening to you, and I my brain is just going in all of this, and I'm coming at this from a very practical point of view, so forgive me if this sounds reductive. So with the local to global, is this part of your PSHE curriculum, or is it part of a wider curriculum that you offer for your students?
Right. So as a kind of freelance, I work with a lot of different schools, and it kind of takes two forms, and invariably it depends on the agenda of the school. And of course, we are change makers. So we want to try, if we can, to change schools' agendas with regards to this. So for many of the independent schools that I work with, for instance, space is found within the curriculum to run this project as an entire academic year project. For other schools, what we tend to do is run the project as kind of half day or day events. But the aim is that whatever is the outcome, there is a legacy left after that. And the legacy isn't just within the school community, it's in the wider community too. So we now have, for instance, as a result of the local to global project last year in West London, we have peer mentorship groups that are set up between a local primary school that has a Somali children in and year 10 students. So the legacy is kind of perpetuating, but I wanted to make it flexible. As a teacher myself, one of the biggest challenges we face is time. So this project is intended to be flexible.
And I am kind of hear that, you know, there is space in some schools to do this. And I just wonder whether there is an imperative to almost shift our understanding of PSHE. You know, we talk about personal, social, mental, emotional, so health and emotional. And actually the G part of that, the global education, often gets put to one side, because I don't even think citizenship necessarily covers the global aspect of it. Is that your experience of what you see in schools?
Absolutely. And you know, the thing, I was co-authoring a book with a guy called Dr. Stephen Whitehead, and we both agree this is a safeguarding issue as much as anything else, to encourage young people to embrace total inclusivity in what they're doing in their curriculum is as much a safeguarding issue as some of the existing PSHE curriculums. But as we know, of course, this is also potentially a destabilizing, certainly for the people, you know, within particular departments, you know, in school governance. This is potentially destabilizing because it does involve a degree of changing how we professionally develop, how teachers' performances are being judged. This is really significant. But I think the imperative is such that we're getting to a point that certainly in my work, you can't have one without the other. It has to be a whole scale approach, really.
And while you were talking, it occurred to me that there might be some conflict between the goals of your project in highlighting and showcasing non-Western pedagogies with the educational trends that are very much part of UK culture. How do we go about navigating that? We've got about a minute and a half left. I know it's a big question.
I think what would be great is to run, let's say, the global teaching pilot we're running in a number of schools this year, and teachers are just running it in one particular module, one particular delivery. We are creating knowledge. There is no point at which we can say, right, let's get this and let's do this next year. We're creating knowledge. And I think the more teachers get involved in applying sort of global pedagogies and teaching methodologies across the subject range, the more we can begin to create that knowledge that can be useful for teachers in future and enhance the experiences of our students.
Absolutely. And as with anything, it's about balance, isn't it? And making sure that we are not just in on a one track goal. We do have to pause there, Rob. I will be following your progress and certainly seeking you out for advice on this. So thank you so much for sharing with us today. We are going to a break and we will be back at 10:55 to start our next session, session 3 at 10:55. Thank you for joining us this morning. Okay, welcome back to Diverse Educators, the 9th conference. And we have 3 more speakers for you. And I'm really delighted to welcome to the stage Naveed Khan, who's going to be talking to us about breaking the proverbial glass ceiling. Morning, Naveed.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about breaking the proverbial glass ceiling. And to start off with, I want to talk a little about my background to put things in context. So there's a picture of me when I moved to England from Pakistan, and I was around 10 years old. And as you can see, my mum was fashionably ahead of her times, dressing me in double denim, and that shirt still fits me today. So I grew up in Pakistan, came to England around 10, couldn't speak a word of English, grew up in a council estate in Sheffield. And one of my teachers said to me at school, "Oh, well, people like you don't go to university," from Pittsmore and so on and so forth. And I ended up going to a Russell Group University. And I share this story because my dad always used to say to me, if you work hard, you can get anywhere. And I really believed that. I thought merit gets you everywhere in life. And then I had a few different jobs before I went into teaching. And I got into teaching and I had quite an interesting sort of 9 years in education. So I started off as an NQT, and in my first year of teaching, I had 11 set 3, and there were 6 sets, so it was like third set from the top. And at the end of my first year, I achieved the best results in the science department. And after that, in my second year of teaching, I became head of science. And within 3 years, the results went from 27% to 82%. With the same team. And I thought, right, I'm going to go, and I started thinking about senior leadership. And every time I mentioned anything to do with senior leadership, I was told, well, no, you don't want to do that. Why would someone like you want to do that? You know, we've had bad experiences with, one head said to me, we've had bad experiences with an ethnic minority becoming a senior leader, so we're not going to go with you. And I just thought, well, this doesn't make sense. Anyway, I got a break and became an assistant head, and then I moved down south to London and became a deputy head. And the school went from special measures to good in 14 months. Results were the best in the school's history. Science results went from the bottom 20% to the top 20% nationally in 3 years, and so on. And then I started applying for headship. And as I was applying for headship, I got really random and unhelpful feedback. And I'll give you some examples. So one of the interviews I went to, the chair of governors, who's quite well known actually. She's an author, not an author. She's a journalist for The Guardian. I won't mention her name, but on the panel there were 12 white females and 1 male from the local authority, and they were all that was predominantly the governing body. And the school intake had 87% were ethnic minority. The entire leadership team was white. Progress rate score was low. It was minus 0.5 or something. And one of the first question they asked me was, how was I going to bring diversity to the school? Which I found quite ironic actually. And I said to them, what are you doing? You know, you've got a seat at the table. How are you bringing diversity to the top at this school? And to be honest, I didn't really like that. Then I had another interview, and throughout my career, I kept getting knocked back for really, I mean, it was like I'd go to my trust meetings and I'd be the only ethnic minority senior leader out of 40. I'd go to, even now when I go to meetings, you know, I'm one or two ethnic minorities in the whole audience in these meetings. And, you know, I get asked really random questions like, is the food okay for you? I'm like, it's pasta, you know, and it's vegetarian pasta. Why wouldn't it be, you know? And it's bizarre because, you know, I don't eat curries all the time. It's really random and stuff like I once walked in and went, oh, it's really hot in here today. They went, oh, you must be used to it. I'm like, well, the Sheffield isn't the tropics. And then all the time, one feedback when I got my interview, I had an interview for headship. The feedback I got was, you don't look like a head teacher. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. And then another one was, I can't give you a reason why we're not putting you to day 2 because you answered so well. So I just said, stop wasting my time, and hung the phone upon him. I mean, you wasted 2 days of my time. I haven't got time for this nonsense. And put the phone down because I thought, if you can't give me a reason, you haven't got a reason. You know, you can't just sit there, waste people's time applying for jobs, going through the motions, and then not getting, and then getting really poor feedback. And there isn't really a reason. You can't put your finger on it. Cut a long story short, I'm in my 2nd year of headship now. And, you know, I've gone on, you know, I think all throughout my career being told you're not good enough or you're not ready or people like you don't become head teachers, and all of this stuff really has frustrated me. And I feel like now I've got a seat at the table, so to speak, as Michelle Obama says. You know, it's about, you know, voicing those issues that ethnic minorities and people from diverse backgrounds, whether it be, you know, there's a gender gap, there's an ethnic minority gap, you know, when you look at sexual orientation, all of these things, it's about time people spoke up about their experiences in these processes and challenge, you know, people at the table, because that's the only way, you know, getting your voice heard, you know, coaching and mentoring. So, you know, anyone who's in a position of power or influence should be out there trying to encourage more people from diverse backgrounds who are strong and who are credible and have proven track records to go and, you know, really go for these positions. I was speaking recently to Dame Sally Coates, and we were talking about some of the issues around diversity and inclusion. And one of the things that came up was, in London, for example, in Redbridge, all the head teachers in Redbridge are white, and the intake is 88% ethnic minority, but no one challenges a white head teacher to say, you know, you don't represent the demographic. But I'm a head of a school which is predominantly white British, and I've been asked 3 or 4 times now, how can you represent this community? How can you be a head of this school if you don't understand the demographic? And I feel like, but on the flip side, someone who's white, middle class, would never get these questions. You know, you go to Camden, you go to any borough in London, predominantly the head teachers are white, and the intake is pretty diverse, but they don't have those challenges. And it's about raising the profile of this issue of why are people from ethnic minority backgrounds, one, not getting to the top? Why are women, female heads, you know, why is there not enough female heads in secondary schools when the profession has a lot of females in the teaching profession, and so on. So I feel like, I think things like these platforms give people a voice to kind of challenge the issue, but also forming allies. So it's about getting people who are influential, who have power, who can change this, bringing them to the table to think about how can we do it, not as a tick box exercise, but people who are genuinely talented, how can we support them moving forward? So I'm just going to finish off by saying, you know, if you are applying for senior leadership positions, make sure you prepare for the interview. Of course, if you've got a strong track record, get a coach, but also if the feedback isn't good enough, make sure you challenge that feedback and really back yourself 100%, because I think if you're going for those positions, you're credible, you've got the background, and really back yourselves 100%, because actually you can get knockbacks and it hits your confidence, and sometimes it kind of wears you down. And at one point it did wear me down, and I was about to leave the teaching profession because I just thought enough is enough, this is not good enough. But actually I'm glad, I dug deep, stuck to it, and now I'm in my second year of headship. So I'll just move on to questions if anyone's got any.
Thank you so much for sharing your personal narrative, but also that leadership journey you've been on. And we hear this a lot from our network, both within the Women Ed Network, the BAME Ed Network, the Diverse Ed Network, this constant failure really of the system to not give good feedback. And I think well done for challenging it, because when we put our hearts and souls into applications and go to interview, the least that the employer can give us is some feedback that is constructive, that can help us. So you've told us about the kind of the poor feedback. Have you had any gifts of really good feedback that did actually help you?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually name him Luke Sparks from Dixon's. I owe him a lot actually. So after the interview there, he just spent about an hour and a half feeding back. And after that feedback, I then went on to get my headship. And that was, he took his time. He went, you're really credible. You've got a proven track record. There's just certain things you probably need to work on in terms of your answers. He went, your answers are right. It's how you structure them will be better. And no one ever said that to me. And someone said that to me, I would take that on board. But when all you get is you don't look like a head teacher, well, I can't change how I look. You're too young. Well, you knew that when I applied my date of birth, and so these are things I can't change. But if someone gives you constructive feedback on how to answer a question, how to structure your answers, that's practical feedback that you can put in place and think about, actually, this is useful feedback and I can do something with it. And I think, I owe a lot to Luke for that feedback, because he did take a lot of time out of his day to give me that feedback. And obviously it made a huge difference to my next interview. But overall, the feedback I've had throughout hasn't. And one school I went to, they gave me their school improvement plan, and I mean, I've never seen something so bad. It was quite poor, and I was really polite about it. I was just like, you're doing an inspection and the percentages don't add up. Like, you're saying 54% of pupil premium, 18% aren't pupil premium. Where are the rest? And then he just got really irate with me and didn't like it. So I was like, well, I'll withdraw, because I don't want to work for you. If you can't accept,
People don't always appreciate the truth, do they, Naveed? Like I was similar. That you're basically challenging when they said to you, what will you do about how will you bring diversity, and when you flipped it, well, what are you doing about the diversity in this space? Like there's a level of accountability here that we need to put back onto the employer, and so that really really resonates with me. So now you've got this seat at the table. Now you are a head teacher. What are some of the things that you're doing to disrupt the pipeline and to create opportunities for others?
So one of the things is I'm really a strong believer in succession planning, and looking at emerging talent from a wide spread of that. So make sure there's opportunities for women, and that, I've got a head of history actually who's going on maternity leave, and she said, it's her second child. And she always says, as a woman, you have to take a step back in your career. Because you're having a child and so on. So and she's very strong, one of the best history teachers I've ever met. So she's actually shadowing the leadership team and attending leadership meetings and, getting that wider experience before she goes on maternity leave. So when she comes back, there might be if there is an opportunity that, actually it is okay to be an assistant head and be part-time. It is, if you're strong and, you're credible. And I feel like it's around offering coaching, mentoring, and actually voicing, kind of sharing my story. That I think out of the secondary heads in the group I work for, I think there's only one other ethnic minority head. And I work for quite a large group. So actually sharing the other side of the table, because sometimes people speak for you, don't they? They think this is your experience without without knowing what your experience is, if that makes sense. And I mean, I went to a conference a few weeks ago, and someone is talking about how difficult it is for ethnic minorities to become heads and so on, but not giving any solutions. So what are we doing? Because what happens is you get to middle leadership level, most people do in from diverse backgrounds, and then they just can't get beyond that barrier. And it's about, but why? If they're successful, what are we doing as heads and people in positions where they can make a difference? How are we including those people? Actually, you are good enough. And my head of history said, in her previous school, she never considered student leadership, even though her results were good, her lessons were good, only because everyone's like, well, you're young, you're gonna have a family, and that's not on, is it? It's not fair.
No, it's not, Naveed. And I think the question I want the audience to really take away from your talk is, like, what does a head teacher look like? What does an SLT member look like? We really need to stop our bias here and think about that visible presence and that visible role modelling. So well done for smashing through that glass ceiling, that concrete ceiling, and for owning who you are, but also modelling that there is a way forward for others. It's been absolutely fantastic to meet you this morning. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you so much, Naveed. We now have Christilla Jamil, who'll be talking to us about disrupting the leadership trajectory. Welcome to the stage, Christilla.
Hi, good morning.
Over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so funnily enough, it was only a week ago that we presented at our Global Unconference for Women Ed on a very similar topic. So it's a joy and a real privilege to have been asked to speak today. And actually, it's been a while since I've connected with Hannah. So I thought I too, like Naveed, would share a bit of my journey. Unlike Naveed, what really, I don't think it shocks me anymore. I think I'm hearing it so often that at school, people are told that, you're not going to go to university. In our profession as teachers, as senior leaders, as head teachers, people are told they don't fit the part because they don't look the part. I haven't had those experiences. Actually, I feel that in order to escalate, I think I've been actually extremely privileged and have managed to go from being a class teacher to my interim position at the moment of CEO. Now, don't get me wrong, I haven't not had barriers and obstacles to overcome, but my obstacles are dissimilar, and I'm beginning to see how my privilege can help people that don't have the same experiences. So being a part of Women Ed and being a part of Women Ed England, we looked at a variety of literature that helps us as leaders. And we're recently reading The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, and came up with our 5 functions of leadership. So our first one is her joy and defining social coded expectations. As a Women Ed group of leaders, we constantly ask ourselves, are we free to lead? What are the expectations for women within particular societies, but also within our own? What are the barriers or indeed expectations that prevent women from leading their way? And things like Naveed alluded to what he was wearing, climate, that, he's in Sheffield and he should be used to the heat. Who defines how we should look, how we should wear, what we should wear, what our hair needs to look like? Who defines what's acceptable and what's not acceptable? And I think the expectations predominantly that we encounter, that I've encountered, are around gender roles. And they're quite openly based on gender stereotypes instead of being based on natural or perhaps inherent gender differences. But women show great parity in taking jobs that were previously regarded to be male-dominated. And by being 10% braver, we're starting to disrupt the leadership trajectory. Women in leadership in education have so much to celebrate. We don't often fit into male-coded structures, but we've started to work together. And I use the term harmonizing because when you work in a harmony, it means you complement coexisting structures in a pleasing way that not only benefits yourself, but benefits everybody equally. And I think the disruption that we want to bring today is going to change work hand in hand and empower others. We empower, we bring about change, we amplify voices. Though our journeys may differ, and those shared this morning, I can see they do differ, each step of our journey defines who we are and who we want to become. And unless we unite, and unless we acknowledge that there's so much work ahead of us, we're going to be stuck with what we've got. Looking at our strength, well, I think we don't challenge by accepting status quo. We actually challenge by acknowledging that there is an injustice, by acknowledging that we are vulnerable, that vulnerability is not failure. Indeed, our own vulnerabilities are things that have enabled us to succeed. My own vulnerabilities enabled me to reach out to Hannah, to become a part of her I Am Remarkable group, to speak at events such as today, to join Heads Up. So for me, my vulnerability has actually been a platform to enable strength, to enable others to create perhaps a women-sized opportunity that fits all women. It shows a collective strength. It magnifies ourselves. We can be who we want to be. We can be the people that we want our students to look at and aspire to become. And then we're not content. Are we content with what we've achieved? No, we're not. We recognise that in order to bring about change, we need action. We need action for women of colour, for women of the LGBT plus community, for those with disabilities, for those who are young, who are old, who are going through the menopause. You know, we need change. We need to be heard. And we're going to be relentless in our mission here, so that it is a lasting impact. We have particular ways of leading that are sustainable to our manner, that are comfortable for us, for our style of leadership. But how do we do that on a larger platform? How do we give back to our community? How are we going to ensure that women who are committed to the same cause are continuing to make this impact by removing the barriers that are there? And this is reflected in our schools. This needs to be, Naveed said, you know, I think it was, I wrote down, in Redbridge, where all the head teachers are white, and yet the population, the communities they serve aren't. You know, how do we disrupt that narrative? How do we treat people with generosity, with kindness and collaboration, but network for the betterment of our students? How do we review policies in place, not just for today, but for future generations? And though I don't have the answers completely, entirely today, I'm leaving you with questions that we should be considering as a group of people. You all know who this is. It's Amanda Gorman, and you know, she was actively chosen to recite a poem at Joe Biden's inauguration. My buddy Claire Price said her favourite quote from Amanda was, "When a skinny black girl descends from slaves, from a black single mother, and can dream of becoming a president, only to find herself reciting for one." But for me, it's the hill that Amanda speaks about that really aligns with our fight today. It's the struggle to climb both socially and politically, how far we still have to go before we reach the top of that hill. Our call today is to unite in disruption. We want to be seen. We need to be heard. We want to leave education and the opportunities it presents for future leaders in a better place than we find it today. We need to find the light in this never-ending shade. We need to acknowledge that as privileged people, because privilege does exist, we need to welcome vulnerability, and that could be our own too. We need to rethink what we're doing, to ask, is what we're doing enough? We need to work together to achieve more. Yes, we've made a start, but we've got such a long way to go. We need to enable our schools, our communities to reflect what we preach, what we believe in. And I think the disruption has just begun, but it needs to continue. So my question to you is, how can we help each other? How can you help yourself? How can we help others where the door has been opened to us? That's it from me.
And congratulations on being made interim CEO and smashing through that next layer of the leadership hierarchy. I've not seen you since you've taken on that role.
It's been a while.
It's been a while, I know, sweetheart. There's a couple of things I want to probe here. And let's start with the idea of embracing vulnerability. And when Abraham talks about like courageous vulnerability, what does that mean? What does that look like? Because it gets talked about a lot, but can you give perhaps some examples of where you've done that in the workplace or in your leadership?
100%. On a personal level, just applying for the interim role, you know, all the syndromes possible, imposter syndrome, all the isms that are there. And instead of reflecting on my strengths, I think I don't think it's as a woman, I think it's as a leader or education, we start to reflect on our what we don't have. So, you know, when applying for a job, instead of looking at that list and thinking, oh, these are my strengths, it's okay not to know everything, because nobody knows everything. It's okay to compliment your team. It's okay with the areas, with the skills that you don't have. But for that moment, I just focused on what I didn't have that prevented me. And of course, I called on a few colleagues, a few friends, and they did empower me to have that courage to apply. And actually, in my application, I wasn't afraid to say, these are my strengths and this is what I can do, but also to say, these are the opportunities where you can help me to grow into the role. And I think by sharing, you know, I haven't been able to listen to today in its entirety because I've been at my parents'. My dad's been a bit unwell of late. But Naveed, it just struck a nerve, all the things he was saying where, you know, stereotypically, we're putting not a glass ceiling, but a concrete ceiling on people. We're making perceptions from ignorance. And that's where I think it's great that, you know, we have these platforms to share this. And how do I do that with the wider community? Well, I tell them it's okay for them to be themselves. I tell them it's okay not to know everything. And then we have obviously a very influential coaching circle through the Women Ed community. But I see it, you know, in my own trust, and I look around and, you know, I've got great head teachers and almost all are women and we're all white. You know, so it's just never ending. And I think we need to look at how we're recruiting. What are we doing to attract a diverse range of leaders here? And I'm not doing enough. So, you know, when Naveed said he doesn't have the answer, it's not that I have the answer, but I think collectively, you know, there's a power there. Collectively, if I share what my struggles are, you know, you're going to come up with something, or someone that knows someone. So I think, you know, this is how we need to embrace vulnerability as a strength. And actually, my failure has given me rise to this platform that I'm now in receipt of, which is a very privileged position indeed. And I need to use that privilege sensibly.
Thank you for articulating that. And like when you were talking, and I love the reframe of going from the 5 dysfunctions to the 5 functions, because that deficit mindset, what I'm hearing you saying there is that we've all got a deficit mindset. We've been conditioned. The system's got a deficit mindset, as Naveed articulated. In that I Am Remarkable workshop you came to, the idea that when we look at an advert, women see that they can do 7 out of 10 things, because they can't do 3 out of 10 things, they don't apply, whereas a man will see what they can do. There is a reprogramming there, isn't there, for us to do? But I liked that reframe about actually what makes a functional team. What are the things we want to try and break? So your first questions was, are we free to lead? What are some of the things that have inhibited you or handcuffed you in your journey to not bring your authentic self to the leadership table?
I think initially, I mean, you know, I entered education very late in life. You know, I started in my late 30s. And I think a lack of experience was the initial obstacle. And then, of course, my attraction is to perhaps disadvantaged areas, schools that need a bit of love and attention. And then HMI was my obstacle, because I wanted to do things that were perceived to be right in HMI's eyes. And it wasn't until I had the crown of success by being good and, you know, a couple of outstanding areas. And I made sure that I kept saying that, because that gave me license to lead. But actually, it's by meeting you, being affiliated with, you know, Women Ed, meeting Alison Peacock, Dame Alison Peacock at the time, who was leading, you know, beyond levels. Levels were taken away. People in primary schools were panicking. We didn't realise the freedoms taking those shackles off of us would actually allow us. So I think experience really has been the biggest barrier that I felt I needed to know everything in order to achieve. And each time I come across an obstacle that doesn't sit with my core values, doesn't sit with me morally, and, you know, a big chunk of my life where I had to just get up and walk away. I think I'm starting to understand that my freedom comes from my strength and from my courage to know that that's not good enough. Actually, sometimes you can't fight it. You have to walk away.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that knowing what to say yes to and knowing what to say no to, isn't it? And sometimes we're saying no to ourselves when we're saying yes to somebody else, and that can be a real compromise. One of the phrases you used has really resonated with the audience around this idea of uniting in disruption. Can you just leave us with your final thought about what was the call to action to the audience around that idea?
Well, do you know, I've been told in the past that I bring conflict, but I look at conflict as being healthy. I look at, you know, questioning things. If I'm surrounded by people who are yes people and agree with me, then I'm not going to be successful, and it's going to really impact negatively on the communities that we serve. So disruption means having the freedom to be you. However you perceive that, you're making the right choices. You know, no job is worth your health. And if you're not given that platform to disrupt, if you're not given the opportunity to be heard, and you need to be seen at the same time, you need to go, because they're not worth you. So I think disruption means having the freedom to lead in whichever way you feel is the best way for the communities you serve, without forgetting that it's got to be the best way for you, because you cannot put aside your core values. You cannot stop believing what you believe in, and you shouldn't be changed to form or fit into a mold that just isn't you. Just be you and be free.
I love that, Christina. Thank you for squeezing us into your hectic personal professional schedule. It's lovely to see you. Go and enjoy your time with your parents.
Well, we have the wonderful Stammer Daniels, who is an educator that I'm becoming very familiar with. I think we spent some time yesterday on the Leading the Diverse Curriculum programme. So it's lovely to see you again.
Thank you for having me today. So I'm just going to share with you some of the journey and the impact that DEI has had in my setting as an international school. We're a British international school, currently in the Middle East. I was raised and trained in London, so I spent a lot of time in London before I came out to the Middle East, and I've been here about 8 years. So just really talking about what our impact is and the purpose of what we're doing and how we're doing that within our setting. So obviously just a quote from Bell Hooks about the classroom just being the most radical space of possibility. And I've heard so many inspiring stories and journeys today that I'm definitely going to take away with me. So hopefully you'll get something from this as well. So even though this is an international school, a lot of the barriers and a lot of the journey that we've been on resonates a lot with a lot of the schools within the UK as well. So you'll see some of the points of the international school is that we have a very transient community. So based on economics and people moving around, children stay generally 4 to 5 years, and we have a small community that stays a lot longer than that. So we really need to take into account who they are and the impact that we can have on their journey, their educational journey, and where they're going on to. So this idea of a global network is really important in our setting. We have a lot of multilingual students, which was very similar to my experience in London as well. We have parents from a range of backgrounds, and also teachers from a range of backgrounds. And this was perhaps a little bit more of a challenge for us, because in the UK, when you're from similar boroughs or similar areas in the UK, there was a more of a similarity between teachers, at least within the same borough. Whereas I've got teachers who have taught in South Africa, in China, in Australia, etc. So all over the world, and they're coming together with very rich experiences, which is great and fantastic, but that also composes a bit of challenge in terms of how we see things and how that translates into our curriculum as well. And then something that's also important to acknowledge is that there is a post-colonial mindset that can unintentionally present itself in our schools. Particularly, we felt from parents, but also from teachers as well, that there is the range of knowledge that is shared, and this links to bias and also our levels of teaching and our levels of knowledge around what we were taught in systems, and how that can end up either manifesting in different things within the curriculum, behaviours, mindsets of parents, and feedback from parents as well. So an example of this is that although we're an international school, we celebrate diversity, we celebrate bilingualism, multilingualism. A lot of parents are very reluctant to put that their child speaks a different language because they want their child to fit into a British system. So they are already coming with a mindset that we're going to exclude them. So it's how we communicate that and how we embrace that within our setting. And this links really closely to being aware of the needs of our community, which again translates to all of our schools. And how do we do that? How do we talk, provide spaces, safe spaces, not only of our students, but our teachers and our parents as well? And how can we make sure that we understand what their needs are? Do they feel comfortable speaking about them? Do they feel comfortable raising them? So we've been doing some work in the school about Maslow's needs of hierarchy, and looked a lot around this world of psychological needs, but also about belonging. So a lot of these words are, shared around. We want our children to feel that they belong, but what does that mean? And what do you actually mean by that? And what do you mean by psychological safety? What do you mean by a sense of connection with each other? So it's really unpicking that, and what does that mean for our students and our community? And really, really thinking about, when we're asking our community to belong to something, what exactly are we asking them to belong to, and on whose terms? So this was quite a challenge in the British community and in the British schools, because there's a certain mindset of what Britain is. And that was quite interesting for me, coming from London, because my Britain, or my experience of Britain is very different to someone else's experience from Britain. It's not a shared experience. So what exactly does that mean? And is it right or wrong? And we had to ask ourselves some very, very challenging questions, actually. And we did a survey with the students, and some quite difficult comments came back, and challenging comments for our staff that were very uncomfortable. And we looked at this as an opportunity to really unpick, and think about what can we do to make sure that future cohorts, and even the children who are saying this, how we can support them to make sure that they feel seen, that they don't feel these thoughts and they don't agree with these thoughts, but also that they have a voice and they have the opportunity to challenge and to ask questions and raise questions around that. And obviously this is linking very, very closely to the idea that this is safeguarding work. This is about making sure that our staff, our students, our community feel safe where they are. In order for our students, our community to flourish, we must feel safe and secure in where we are. So how are we doing that, and exactly what does that look like? So this was a very, very layered approach. And as we started looking at this in a school, and I think that, again, this is when I've spoken to colleagues around the world in many different settings, in many different international settings and local settings to the UK, it's how can we do this in a way that doesn't bring up barriers, that doesn't make people feel like they're being left out, or when we're distributing the power, that it's not about removing power, it's sharing it out and making sure that everybody's voice is heard. And it is this space for open and honest conversations, and really teaching about empathy for everybody. But it's challenging. It's very, very challenging work, and it's not easy to do. And although we're on our journey, and we're into our third year now, obviously COVID, we completely shut down during COVID. So that did cause a bit of a halt in some of our work. But we are really committed to making sure that this work doesn't stop. And we're creating these spaces with our students, with our staff, and with our parents as well, to make sure that people can feel safe to speak up. One thing that a lot of British schools have to do in international settings, which we are governed by different laws, and one thing we have to do is respect our host country and the laws and cultures within our host country. And that's primarily, again, to protect our staff and students. We don't want our staff and students to be saying or doing anything that is considered illegal in our countries. But again, we see that as an opportunity, is when you go to visit other countries, that respect, that honouring of other cultures is important, that we all do that. And that is part of the British values as well, in order to do that. So we see that as an extension of that. We've really, really looked at our curriculum, and Bennie mentioned I was on her course yesterday, which was great, and just sort of opened up more doors and windows for me to have a look at and think about and consider. But this notion that our curriculum can be mirrors and windows, and the windows aspect is what we really found really like an area that we really needed to focus on, because a lot of the teachers previously felt that historically, when our cohort was a lot more generically white British, that we didn't need to have a range of different books, and it depends on who's in your class, it depends on the demographics in your school, when actually it doesn't, and it shouldn't. Your school should be in every area of it, whether it's the curriculum, whether it's your library books, whether it's your posters, whether it's the resources that you use in your classroom, should be the windows that they see, and they see representation from all of the intersectionalities across the protected characteristics. So they should be seeing that regularly, all the time. Another thing that we're really proud of is our student leadership, and creating that space for students to really take on projects and take on their own journey in this space. So where we feel it's important that they're guided and they're supported with that, because it's very challenging for adults, yet alone students. we are also fully aware that the students come up with their own ideas, and they're very, very committed and very passionate about a lot of these issues, and are very articulate and explaining them and presenting them to each other. So this is something that we're really working on and making that really a huge project, and also within our classes as well. So I've shared this before, but this is just such a fantastic example of why it's so important to create spaces within your curriculum, within your classrooms, for children to respectfully challenge, to ask questions. So year 6, we were looking at World War. We looked at Winston Churchill as a hero, and a child was like, this, with respect, Winston Churchill wasn't a hero for my country, and went on to explain why. And that was commendable, obviously, for the teacher, because he allowed that space for the child to talk. And then they went on and had a discussion, and the child was able to present his views. It's absolutely exactly what we want to encourage. And that all these changes, although seem small, have a huge impact on our mindsets and the things that we do in school. So 2 books that I just really wanted to recommend that have I've shared with other staff in my school, if you're in an international setting, but even, some of the speakers today, we talk about, I'm also an immigrant to the UK. My parents came from different countries. So this Growing Up in Transit book has really resonated with me on lots of levels. And you'll find a lot of the children within your community will have some of the needs or the politics around what it is like to grow up in transit. And we also have Wish We Knew What to Say, which is just a great way to sharing with your staff if they're not sure or don't feel confident about what they're doing. And I just want to leave you with a really important quote, because what we do is so much more important than what we say or what we believe. The actions that we do are really important. So the goals, and this has been mentioned, show up as yourself, be seen and see others. I don't think we can underestimate the power of doing that and seeing others, and, respecting, representing, talking to others, and empower those around you to do the same, and stand up and show empathy. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you for having me on. One thing I just wanted to add to this, because something that I've done this year, which was huge for me, and I've been teaching for many years, is that I started using my maiden name, which was very important and links me to the islands where my family are from, which are in Maluku in Indonesia. And it was a huge step for me. And I think that example of showing up and being seen, although small, seemingly small, was a huge step. And I think that those kind of steps that we take within ourselves to reflect on ourselves and think about what are we doing and what messages are we sending in our daily actions and daily interactions are so important for the children to see.
It's great to have you here, and I'm loving hearing the update of all the work you've been doing over the last couple of years since we connected and since you double barreled your name, and thank you for sort of speaking about that. So let me do a little bit more probing. I love that quote from Bell Hooks about radical spaces. Just tell the listeners a little bit more about how do we create radical spaces in our learning environment?
It seems challenging, but it can be easy, and just simply allowing spaces for children to talk. And this idea of radical, it makes me laugh, really, because I think I had a conversation with a senior leader, and and it was like, I was really radical, this idea of equality, and it's like, well, I don't see equality as being a radical concept. I see it as being like a core of what we're doing, and I don't see any of this work as being radical. I see it as the foundations of what we need to do. So the radical kind of movement is just thinking and reflecting on yourself. What are you doing on a day-to-day? And it is like, are you shifting the resources that you're using? Are you choosing to seek out a variety of different resources or books or images that you're using within your classroom? So yes, I know Bell Hooks is like, it's radical. It seems radical, and sadly it is seeming to be radical, but it should be the foundation of everything that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit like when people say courageous conversations. They're really just conversations. We sometimes perhaps badge things, but is it radical for us to be teaching about empathy? How are you creating these safe classroom spaces where we're really developing that empathy between different identity groups?
That's really hard, but actually it's with the children, it's not that difficult. They're actually super empathetic, and probably more so than a lot of parents. And that's why the opportunities and the privilege that we have to work with these young peoples and shape their minds. And it is linked to that bias. It is linked to, what are we doing to actually make sure that they have that space, they have the opportunity to look, how would you feel if that was you? How would you feel if someone, if you were in these shoes? And it's even when you're highlighting people, because there is this whole, we want to showcase people, but we don't want them to feel that they're different. So this kind of balance of having that. But children are honestly much more empathetic than we think they are, giving them the opportunity to look at reading stories, simply reading stories from another space, and realizing that they're actually a lot more simple. We all have the same needs. We want to be loved. We want to be acknowledged. We want to be heard. We want to be respected. We want to be treated with respect. And that's that kind of culture that we build and model as educators is so important.
Absolutely, that cultural intelligence, that cultural competence. So give a few examples to the listeners about how you've gone about creating those opportunities for student voice. How have you really tapped into your pupils and their lived experience?
So the survey that we conducted was just like a starting point, and it was a very difficult point, but we needed that to take that beyond sort of the classroom and make sure that we had an overview. But that really gave us conversation starters within the classroom as well, and gave teachers an understanding of why they need to have these conversations with students. We then looked at our PSHE curriculum and really looked at how we're providing opportunities for circle time and making sure that our curriculum was responsive in terms of the needs of the children and things that came up, rather than just following the curriculum as a week by week, and really allow for that space. The student leadership has been fantastic. So we now have a student leadership body in primary and in senior school that are both DEI connected, but really stressing the fact that they are there to support all of the other networks that are there. So the teaching and learning committee, the wellbeing committee, etc., and that the DEIJ thread runs through everything that we're doing in our school. So really empowering students and listening to them to see what they see, and they're coming up with fantastic ideas.
So what I'm hearing there is there's that matrix, that parallel of the pupil voice and the staff voice opportunities within the school as well. My final question, because there's lots of lovely comments about your use of the metaphor around mirrors and windows that comes from Dr. Rudine Sim Bishop's TED Talk. Just finish off with some ideas about how you've consciously created those mirrors and those windows in the curriculum.
So hugely, we looked at our English curriculum first of all, and really dropped in a lot of books that were relevant, and again around the idea of empathy. So we looked at The Boy at the Back of the Class, we looked at Coming to England, and really incorporating that within our curriculum. So it wasn't not I don't want to say just a class reader, because they're important, but it was actually embedded, and the children were able to unpick that. The teachers were able to unpick it, and really look at the kind of motives and the characters and the stories behind that. But in terms of libraries, we looked at libraries as well in primary and senior, and made sure again that the representation of books were widespread and available. It is ongoing, because obviously budget, you need to plan that out. But I think that's a strength and not a weakness. The idea that you're spreading it out over years and drip feeding it in regularly is much better than having a huge overhaul and that kind of falling by the wayside. So keep feeding it in, keep dripping it in, keep sharing those stories, and encourage the children to bring in their stories as well. So we're going to have a bilingual book club next term, where the children are going to be translating books in their own language, and just really empowering children to share their stories with the rest of the community in the school.
Brilliant, Esther. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Oman. Fantastic to have international educators on the call. Lots of brilliant ideas there for the audience. Go and enjoy the family day, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll be back at 11:50 UK time for part 4 with our final 3 speakers. See you then. Welcome back to our 9th virtual Diverse Ed event. It might be morning, afternoon or evening, depending on where you are following us from today. But we're now on part 4. I'm about to join our 9th, 10th and 11th speakers from today's event. So our next speaker is a fellow changemaker and disruptor, Adam Vasco, who's going to be talking all about how to challenge the status quo. Good morning, Adam. It's lovely to see you.
Good morning. Nice to see you too, Hannah. Great event so far. You're doing such a great job, everyone. Well done.
Fabulous. Over to you then. Let's hear your call to action and your goals for the system.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Right. So let's see. Hopefully, there we are. We're away. Okay. So yeah, as Hannah's talked about there, do disrupt, change the status quo. I was given this as a journal, as a present. It's a book journal by Mark Shaler. Just jotting some things down by a friend, and it really resonates with me, as did Christina's talk before about being united in disruption. So I think I'm going to start off by an admission. I love data, and I know that's a really weird thing to say as we talk about these things. But, critical race theory talks about the need for interest convergence. So we have to use the vehicles that we have in order to be able to get a buy-in. And the buy-in for me is to say that the system is broken, or perhaps it's doing exactly as it's intended to. And obviously I've got that picture of, Ken Robinson's famous TED Talk. Local lad, by the way, he's from Liverpool. So yeah, Scouse is changing the world everywhere. And essentially, you know, I really do think that this is in the DNA, and as he said, the fabric of education, the gene pool of education, of how we think about education, academia, thinking of academic things, abstract things. And it's nonsense. You know, education was born in the likeness and image in the interests of economics and the Industrial Revolution. And we need a revolution in education. But the revolutions happen from within. And, you know, it's down for us to be, the revolution won't be televised, as in, it's not going to be something that's led by other people. That's the uncomfortable truth with it. And I think a theme from today in terms of goals is that there are lots of uncomfortable truths, getting increasingly comfortable with being uncomfortable. You know, we've all heard that said before. And we jump through hoops despite knowing that isn't quite the right thing. So I'm putting it towards essentially at this moment in time, and I put myself firmly in here as well. I hope that we could try and convince you that we are moving in the right direction. We're part of the problem. We jump through hoops despite knowing things isn't quite right. So, you know, let's think about the current craze and drive around curriculum. Great, of course, curriculum is absolutely important. When wasn't it important? As educators, when was not that the focus that you thought about? What do I need to teach? When do I need to teach it? In what order? And those types of things. Have those knowledge organizers, curriculum maps, the roadmaps, and all those things, and the internet intention and implementation, those 3 I's. Have they made a sustainable difference and dent on that data? Nationally, they haven't. That's the reality of it. So it's about, you know, let's use again that interest conversion. The Read Write Inc. sort of report has come out about from the EEF. Is anyone surprised that it doesn't necessarily work? You need a bought-in scheme. Phonics, okay, might be important. We don't need a bought-in scheme for those things. So why do we jump through the hoops? I don't think we can continue to blame the system. We are the system, or certainly part of it. So we do have to disrupt, we do have to change the status quo, or we are the status quo. I was sent of this by a friend, and I talked to some of the things that we're beginning to do. I literally mean beginning to do it at the University of Wolverhampton where I work. And, you know, just because we've done things a certain way doesn't mean that we should continue to do it. And yeah, amen to that, absolutely. I mean, originally, and I see myself as an early years practitioner. So, you know, as that, what did I do? I saw the strengths of children, provided opportunities to further those. I looked at areas for development, providing multiple opportunities to scaffold, free play, taught sessions to develop. And the early years, you know, it gets so much right. And I think we could learn so much from early years education. And then we get to this whole idea of GLD, and maybe there's the first type of sign that we begin to value certain things. And what I love about some of the things about the early years, you know, about those effective characteristics of learning, we have the importance of physical development, PSED, but already the knowledge, understanding the world and creative development drop off in terms of what is important for a GLD. I just want us to think about that for a minute. Knowledge and understanding of the world is taken away as is one of the things to move on from. There's a real disconnect there. I really think so. And then, you know, as we move into key stage 1, 20% roughly of children nationally aren't ready for the year 1 curriculum yet. We hammer on at those things, and how often do we actually see that curriculum being embedded into year 1? And maybe it is, maybe it's just my experience of things, but that was my experience, not too much. As a primary educator, I go back, and I was really fortunate to sort of cut my teeth in a school community where we did focus on curriculum and what our children needed in the early to mid noughties, that long time back. And we knew that in a school where we had huge areas of high social deprivation, we were one of the most deprived wards in the country. See the way I'd be able to rattle all this off, because we had to justify it when Ofsted came in. But we knew that cultural capital was going to be absolutely key. And, you know, what we needed to give was the opportunities to the children, which other children may have, but for our children, they didn't. And that was almost the underpinning of all our curriculum. As a result of that, our children did exceptionally well. I'm not here to talk about, oh, we've done an amazing job, but we were in a really challenging area, and our data was some of the best in the city. So we did change things. We were out everywhere. We did what we thought we needed to do. And it was a real eye-opener for me, I think. And I think it again comes back to this thing of the data being that, you know, ultimately that's the thing that we're judged on. So if we can have an impact on some of that, we can narrow some of those gaps, then Ofsted, regardless of, you know, let's not talk about them too much in the some of the misdemeanors that have even happened over this week. We don't do things for them, but they are a vehicle and they come and make judgments. But no one can argue with what we do to make a change, because at the moment we have a set of data that says that what we do doesn't work for a large proportion of people, and that's a model, I think, and we really have to make that change. So bringing you up to where I am now, and now work as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Wolverhampton, across the Faculty of Education, Health and Wellbeing. It is a broad church. It takes in, I'm now out of my comfort zone of just being education. We're looking at health, nursing, sport, psychology, lots of those different things. And I think that what has really struck me is that in a situation where I've got the agency and autonomy to make change, then we are going to do some of that. We are going to challenge the status quo. We're going to go back into what the gene pool of academia is, and assuming what, you know, the changing and disrupting and getting rid of some of these assumptions of things, because it really is inbuilt. And genuinely, I believe that we're sort of part of the problem, not the solution at the moment. I know there's brilliant work, and I know I'm preaching to the converted, and listening today, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting the people that have listened to are part of a problem. But as a sector, we will only change if we do unite in disruption, going back to what Christina said. And I love that image there, you know, of you know, that whole thing, if you judge a fish and its ability to climb a tree. That's what we need to do. The system's got to be totally disrupted, and it isn't about making reasonable adjustments. The system was made, it was born, you know, this is a bit like, I compare it a little bit to the American idea, you know, pro-Second Amendment. It was an amendment. It tells us that we can change things. Systems and things have been written, rules have been written. We are able to change them. And I think there's a moral obligation to that. I haven't launched it with academic quotes or anything else. And instead, I do like a few things from pop culture. And I was running around the other day, and a bit of Biggie came on, Notorious B.I.G. And it starts off, to all the teachers that told me I'd never amount to nothing. And you think, wow, there are multiple times, yes, we see in education when we see the impact people can make. You know, we see, whether it's Ian Wright or we've seen Adele, we see Harry Styles reaching out in recent times, you know, to their teachers. What about those times where, because of the system that we have, because of how narrow we look at things, that we've missed genius in our class? Notorious B.I.G. Biggie Smalls was in someone's class, and the teachers would tell me wouldn't amount to nothing. That Paul McCartney and George Harrison went to school together and didn't do that well in music. There was genius in those classrooms. And how many times maybe has genius been in our classroom and our classrooms, and maybe we haven't quite got to realizing that genius. And so for me, it comes back exactly back to what Christina was saying. It is about us absolutely changing the system, and we use that convergence of interest. You know, thinking about the data tells us that for large groups of people, we are not doing the right thing. We have a moral obligation to address that, a moral obligation to change that, and we've got every data set to say it isn't working. I think as leaders, that's our moral responsibility to make a change. And with the greatest will in the world, if we carry on just doing the same things, I'm not entirely sure that we're going to get a huge change. I think that was 10 minutes. And I sort of managed to time myself. Was it 10 minutes?
It was 10 minutes. You were absolutely bang on, Adam. Nice to meet you in person. It is an absolute pleasure to listen to you. I'm fascinated by kind of macro level systems, and I've watched the Sir Ken Robinson, the animated shorts, and it makes sense to me. You know, it makes sense to me that there was a system designed to very much uphold the forces of capitalism, and that we have continued down the path of and reinforced that capitalist model. This is where people accuse me of being a communist. Now, what I'm interested in is, what does disruption of that system actually look like in practice? Where do we put in those interventions? How does that shift?
So it's like anything else, I guess. So when we're thinking about being an ally in any way, and as Nova talks about that thing of learning, unlearning, and responding. For me, that's the same thing. So ultimately, it's about going back into the system and thinking about what is it that we really do need to change within there. So within things like higher education, for example, and we value, we put this huge value on research. Now, research is absolutely important. Of course, that's incredibly important. And actually, in higher education, the route to progression is best seen through research. To be becoming a doctor, a professor, readers, all those types of things. What we don't reward as well is the practitioners who are on the ground making a difference. It's about going into the fabric of it and completely challenging things. Of us deciding why is it that we value. So in higher education, again, academic writing is essentially the gatekeeper whether we are successful or not. So in those areas of professional practice that we're looking at in my faculty at the moment, do our best attaining students, those who get first and 2-1s, are they the best teachers? Are they the best midwives? Are they the best podiatrists, best psychologists? The answer is no. There isn't a direct correlation. So what are we doing then? What is that? So that we've got an attainment gap, but the attainment gap is assessing what? And I think that's what's happening even when it comes to in schools as well. We are so narrowly looking at children. I give an example of. It sounds like a bit of a boast, this, and I suppose it is because I'm dead proud of it. I'm a Liverpool supporter, and when I was in school, we've been lucky enough that a young boy, Curtis Jones, who currently plays in Liverpool's first team, was in our school. Curtis would still say now he would describe himself as being thick. Now, he has potentially, that's genius level. To get to being that successful isn't such a small pool. If we've got a system where he thinks he's not succeeded in education, yet he is a genius at something, we are doing something very, very wrong. So I'm not saying I have all the answers to it, but we have to challenge it. I'm certain.
I absolutely agree. And to me, it strikes me that actually it comes down to metrics again, isn't it? We are obsessed as a society with measuring progress, and we have been for a very, very long time. And there's that conflict between, I guess, non-Western pedagogies, which is partly what we're talking about here, and the need to categorize that is very much part of Western European culture, and that clash is hard to reconcile.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's not. I think this is the uncomfortable. It's not a system that's failing. It's a system doing exactly what it was set out to do. It benefits a certain group of people, and until we really challenge some of those things. I think we've got an issue. It's really interesting when you look at the public sector, and David Lashaga talks about this. The public sector and things like education, health, and the places where we think of being liberal bastions, really, of those types of things. It's probably where diversity is at its worst, and we see inequality in its greatest impacts. And I'm not saying that the private sector is suddenly some wonderful bastion of or utopia of diversity. However, if you can put money on the table, and if that's what we're talking about, they'll let you succeed. They don't care about anything else. So I think that this type of thing of basically education it's gatekeeperism, and unless we really start to challenge that. And because we benefit from it sometimes, I'm in a really senior position now. I've done well through being through the academic route as such, but we've got to put the drawbridge down to let people come back up. Otherwise, we're just hypocrites. I
know it feels like we can go around in circles in this, but because the system is so intricate, and you really have to dig into the history of education, assessment, measurements to be able to really to kind of start to unlearn it, and I think that's something that we're all talking about, this process of unlearning. Adam, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I am very much hoping our paths will cross again soon.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Everything you said really resonated there, and that just that reflection about Are we the gatekeepers? I think is something for us all to be thinking about. I'm delighted to welcome to the stage next another Esther Cummins. Connected on Twitter for a very long time, Esther. You're one of our book contributors. Nice to finally see your face, and I'm looking forward to hearing your voice. So over to you.
Hi, Hannah. Hi, it's lovely to be here, and yeah, it's been a real pleasure to listen to everybody this morning. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I'm Esther Cummins. I'm the course leader for the MA Education at Falmouth University. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Manchester, and I'm sure, like everybody here, it's just a busy life that we lead in part of our doing our work around this inclusivity and diversity and kind of what that means. So today I'm going to be sharing a little bit around my own research, and I'm going to be also talking about my own practice, and hopefully hope together we'll be journeying along together. So as I look through, the questions really that I'm going to be asking are these two. What is the ethos of your setting, and what is your role in impacting this ethos? These two questions underpinned a lot of what I looked at as part of the data collection stage for my PhD, but also with my own practice. It's something I keep coming back to, of what actually is it that I'm saying versus what it is that I am doing as part of the ethos of my setting. And when we talk about ethos, it's one of those words that it conjures, like gets all wrapped up in culture, in values, in mission, and so forth. So just before I start, I'm just going to clarify a little bit what it is that I mean when I'm talking about ethos, and that's by going through into the academic literature. This key definition, these two definitions by Donnelly, are often what we think about. So firstly, that ethos is this formal expression of the authority's aims and objectives for an organisation. So a lot of that is that mission statement or that strapline. It could be something that goes at the top of a policy, or it could be something that's up on the wall. It could be something that's on your settings website. But also Donnelly talks about ethos that emanates from individuals and group interactions. And in this sense, it's not what is formally stated or documented, but is a process of social interaction. It's not independent from the organisation, but inherently bound up within it. And for me, this is so important when we think about this work around inclusive statements. Nobody is going to have up on their website, "We don't like children," or "You are not welcome here," or "You're only welcome here if," with a list of particular characteristics. And so actually for us, we need to be unpicking then what that inclusive ethos is all about. I liken it a little bit to buying something like a Pepsi Max. So if you were buying a Pepsi Max, and if you drank from any of these cans, you'd have this expectation of what it was that you were going to be drinking. And for some of us, if those cans contained a full sugar Pepsi or a diet Pepsi or Coca-Cola, we might not really be able to taste much of a difference. But we would be able to taste the difference if it was lemonade, or if it was water, or Dr. Pepper, or worse still, if it was oil or vinegar, or something that was really quite unpalatable. And it's similar in this sense, I think, to thinking about our inclusive statements of what we say and what we do, because actually we don't want that massive gap between the two. And I often think with this work, this isn't just because we want something to taste nice. We don't just want somebody to have a nice experience. But I'm sure, as you'll all agree, this is about human beings. This is about actually people's lives, whether that's the lives of our staff members or our parents or our students. All of this work that we're talking about today is about those experiences of people. And I think that's why it's so important to keep going back to this inclusive ethos and what that actually means. And when I talked about stating the obvious, as they say, sometimes we can think, oh, it's just saying something, but actually it's more than that. It is about these experiences. So what is it that we can do about this? What can we do if actually we recognise that ethos isn't just going to magically happen? It's not just going to be like we think that we want to be inclusive, or we think that we'd like to be diverse, or we think we want to decolonise our curriculum, but actually we need to step in to actually doing this. And this picture here is that, again, it's such an educational analogy where we talk about this journey, but I think it's really important to keep coming back to actually there is no end point with this. So I'm not coming here saying I've got it. Everything I do is fully inclusive. Everything I do is perfect. Everything I do ensures that everybody is fully included and valued and celebrated and never get it wrong. But rather it's recognizing that we're all on this journey together, and it doesn't matter what our starting points are. It's recognizing there actually isn't an end point to it, but also it's recognizing this gap. And I think too often that we focus a lot on say these data gaps, which are really important, and hear me on that, but we focus there on almost that end product of going, oh my goodness, these groups of children or these groups of students aren't doing as well as we as their peers. And why is that? Oh, it's because they've got this protected characteristic. But it's going back those few steps and thinking actually about this ethos, because actually if we're talking about key things like belonging, if we're thinking about being valued, if our students and our pupils and our team members aren't feeling that, then actually the performativity is going to be an issue in turn. So what exactly can we do about it? I've talked here quite a lot about the importance, but I want to give you just a few thoughts on possibly what we can do. And for many of us, this isn't new information, but it's helpful just to frame this and to keep coming back to some of what we recognise as good practice, but also to do this together. So part of changing the ethos is thinking about reflective cycles. And I'm a big fan of reflective cycles, because I think it takes us from just having a nice thought into some sort of action. It very much kind of narrows it down into something that actually we need to do. And what I love about Jasper's cycle here is that actually it isn't just this one-off time. It's this continual cycle to come through time and time again to make sure that actually each of our experiences, each of our revelations, each of our reflections gets translated into action. And so that could be from talks you've heard today, it could be from something you've read, it could be something that comes up on the news, it could be something that happens in your classroom, but it's taking that and it's actually doing something with that. And I think as I think about what it is that we actually need to do, I think firstly, it's thinking about embedding it. It's thinking that actually we can't just do this one-off experience. In my research, sometimes people talked about having these values and visions days. Great, I think that's wonderful, but don't just leave it there. Think about actually what that looks like in terms of beyond the display board. What does that look like in each of your subjects? What does that look like in each of your settings? And keep returning to it as a conversation. Return to the fact that actually you need to find out, and by asking different what it is they're experiencing. And with those experiences, they need to be safe power spaces, by which I mean actually a head teacher talking to a child might not actually give a realistic picture of what that child's experiencing. Don't impose it. Again, my research found that some people found that they were just told what to think. And don't compare yourself to others, just learn. I love the diverse educator statement of being where you're celebrated and not tolerated, and using each of those characteristics in turn. So don't be afraid either to leave your setting if you need to. So finally, if you want to know more, this is a bit of a shameless plug. I've got an event that I'm running on Tuesday with our masterclass on values in education around discourse and harmony. But do also get in touch with me. I'd love to hear more from where you're at with this. It's really brief, but I would love to get in touch and again read the book, because I've got a contribution to the chapter there as well. So that's me done, and I understand now I'm going to be asked some questions.
You're going to be interrogated. I love the fact that we can hear your timer. That was.
Oh yes, sorry.
No,
I was like,
music to my ears. I love it. We're on time. So I get the nebulousness of this idea of ethos, and I think a lot of us really struggle with being able to define what it is, pinning it down in the first place, working out how it's created. But what really struck me is this idea of how you go about changing an ethos. Mm-hmm. Now, we'll often talk about change models in education, and you shared one of those change models. Are they applicable generally to creating an ethos, or is that something less tangible? Is there something less tangible about it?
I think sometimes that because it is nebulous and it is difficult to pin down, that sometimes people then shy away from it, and sometimes we can kind of jump into what we're seeing. And I think kind of on a slightly different note, it was a lot what we saw with British values when that came into school. So suddenly you saw these beautiful display boards, because that was how you could show that you were promoting them. But actually what that looked like in your curriculum was very different. But I think actually you can use these change models, but I think you have to then pin down these different voices. So actually, what is it that you want people to be experiencing, and are they experiencing it? So for instance, given the really basic of feeling welcome, actually, what does that look like for different groups of people? Is it accessible? Is there a prayer space? Is there food that people can eat? And some of those may seem superficial, but almost they're the starting points. But can you say somebody's name properly? And all of it really, really matters. And if we can't be bothered to do that stuff, then actually I don't see how we can go into the deeper belonging and the deeper conversations around how people are feeling.
And in what you were saying, I can hear the importance of voice in all of this, that within those change models, nothing happens without voice. So much change is imposed, isn't it? How do schools go about capturing these seemingly quite disparate ideas? What should they do? What advice would you give?
Firstly, I think not being afraid to hear the voices, and not be, I think sometimes we can only want to hear the positive. Sometimes I hear well, nobody's ever challenged us on this, and it's like, or nobody's complained, and it's like, yes, because you haven't really given them a safe space to do that, have you? So I think that's important. Recognizing that actually you're not necessarily, when I say you're not going to please everybody, I don't mean that as like you can't just change overnight. However, I think if you understand the value of individuals and people, then actually those conversations come up more naturally. I think a huge part of it is senior leaders and team and staff modeling that vulnerability as well. That vulnerability of saying, I haven't got this. I haven't got all of this right, and therefore that creates much more dialogue with parents and students.
And it requires a deep humility and a setting aside of ego to be able to say, actually, we might not be getting it right. And there's lots of examples of schools that have been pulled up for their lack of inclusive ethos in a really tangible sense, with staff and parents saying it's not working, who haven't then acknowledged that it needs to be done. When we talking about one of the things that I want to pick up again just before we finish is this idea of saying versus doing. That kind of really struck me, and it's very similar to Mary Myatt's "Live your values, don't laminate them." And people are. There's a lot of schools. Hannah will say there's a lot of schools that say we are inclusive.
Yeah.
Do we think just people have a fundamental lack of understanding of what inclusive means?
Yes, but I also think, when I think of my own journey with it all, for instance, when we think about racism, I'd have been horrified 10 years ago to be called, like, to say that any of my actions were racist. Like, absolutely horrified. How dare you say that? That's not how I am. Like, that's not who I am. Whereas actually, I think the more you journey with it, the more that you recognise how much you perpetuate those, like the institutional racism and things like that.
Yeah.
And so I think it isn't necessarily that people lie. I think some of it is almost like that, being prepared to recognise that you're not the perfect model. And I think that's that, I think then is that journeying. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. I mean, I could continue the conversation. I'm sure we will at some point, but thank you for joining us today, Esther. It was really lovely to see you in person via a screen.
I love your humility, Esther. I think you've inadvertently just recruited your next cohort of your MA. If you could please share your MA details in the Twitter feed. You've got some people who are very interested in your research. We have had Lizzie Swan waiting very patiently in the wings now to come and be our final speaker of the day. Lizzie, it's lovely to see you, and I'm really excited to hear from you about the research you're doing into the experience of girls and women who have ADHD. So without further ado, over to you.
Thanks so much, Hannah and Bennie, for having me today. So I'm here today to talk to you about ADHD and girls. I'm Lizzie Swan, and huge thank you for joining me today, and inviting me here. And hopefully today together we're going to learn more about girls and women with ADHD. And I'm drawing on 20 years of classroom teaching and working with children, young people and adults in my role as SENCO, senior leader and head teacher of a special school, followed by postgraduate study of psychology. And hopefully today I'm going to share some awareness with you. And I also have ADHD. So I'm going to start off by looking at what is ADHD. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a condition that affects people's behaviour. People with ADHD can seem restless, may have trouble concentrating, and may act on impulse. And that's a diagnosis, a definition, that comes from the NHS website. And many people reading that will think, God, that's quite insufficient. And I would absolutely agree. And that's hopefully why we're here today, to add some meat to those bones. And this is a definition from Dr. Thomas Brown that I prefer and feels more applicable to me and many other people, particularly girls and women and people who identify as female. ADHD is a complex syndrome of developmental impairments of executive function, the self-management system of the brain. And if you've not already delved into the world of executive functioning, that's something that we will hit upon today. It's a system of mostly unconscious operations, and our executive functioning is often referred to as the self-management system of the brain. These impairments are situational, variable, chronic, and significantly interfere with functioning in many aspects of a person's daily life. Many people I speak to say, oh, I think I've got ADHD. I identify with many of those things. But the aspect here is that they significantly interfere with functioning in many aspects of their life. So what is ADHD? There are 3 subcategories of ADHD: hyperactive or impulsive, inattentive, or combined. And what we're going to be exploring today is around girls and women with ADHD. Most girls and women with ADHD identify with inattentive ADHD. And what does that mean? It's about difficulties getting going, forgetfulness, distractibility, zoning out or daydreaming, time blindness. Time blindness is something I hadn't even heard of until a few months ago, when I read Gabor Mate's book, Scattered Minds, and about emotional dysregulation. And one of the reasons why this is quite challenging for professionals to identify is because so many of these elements can be internalized by girls and women, whereas so many of the symptoms of ADHD that are more commonly found with boys are externalized, and those are those hyperactive or impulsive aspects around hyperarousal, difficulty sitting still or waiting in line, fidgeting, that constant need to be on the go. And that hyperactivity or that impulsivity can be most commonly found with women, is also found internalize, that inner sense of restlessness, their mind constantly on the go, and that impulsiveness. And for women, and girls, there can be many, many negative consequences from uninhibited behaviors and rash decision making. Many women who identify or have got a diagnosis of ADHD refer to an ADHD tax that can be associated with impulsive spending or impulsive or rash behaviours. And we'll come on to that a little bit later. That combined ADHD diagnosis will be a combination of both hyperactive or impulsive and inattentive. And what that can look like in girls and women is elements of the inattentive criteria, but also manifesting that hyperactivity through, as you'll probably notice with me, over talking, interrupting others, making impulsive decisions, and that psychological or mental hyperactivity. So going back to Dr. Thomas Brown's definition of ADHD, and this is something that is being discussed more and more amongst professionals, is that deficit or challenges around executive functioning. And Dr. Thomas Brown clusters it together around these executive functions, challenges around initiation of tasks, getting started. I cannot tell you how much I anguish around what PowerPoint presentation template. Canva is one of the best things to ever happen to me, but also one of the worst things to ever happen to me, because I spend hours and hours of my time thinking about what Canva presentation model to use. Focus, that's not just about concentration, but it's also about sustaining that focus once the novelty is over. And again, that trips over into effort. I have intense periods of hyper focus, which is one of the best elements of my ADHD, but also one of the most challenging when it comes to sustaining it. And also about emotions and that regulation. Memory, we talk a lot in education around short-term memory now, thank goodness, but also around our long-term memory and that self-regulation of behaviour. So assessment of ADHD in girls and women, why have we got so many challenges? So we have difficulties here around diagnostic tools and clinician awareness, because the diagnostic tools for ADHD are so skewed towards the male perspective. So much of it was that before 1980, there was no real understanding of anything other than the hyperactive model. And there have been no studies around girls until 2002. That's how recent this awareness is. If I could ask Hannah or Bennie to give me an idea of how much time I've got left, that would be really helpful for me. That would be great. Going back to gender roles as well. So many of, thank you, Richard, that's great. So many of the misunderstanding, so much of the misunderstanding around ADHD is because girls will conform to gender roles. So a lot of the behaviour that we'll see is around that passive behaviour, one pushing themselves to conform. So professionals are trying to raise their, needing to raise their awareness, to more passive behaviour. Girls with ADHD, particularly those who have a higher IQ, will push themselves to just try harder, and they'll be masking their behaviour, particularly in the classroom and in the community. Those comorbidities around anxiety and depression, particularly when they reach puberty, often mask the underlying ADHD and can lead to misdiagnosis. And there I've hit on hormones, particularly around estrogen. So often with ADHD, when we start with, when girls start puberty, that's when the estrogen tends to cause fluctuations in their ADHD symptoms and can cause significant challenges around their mood regulation, but also impacts on their executive functioning skills. And as many people are starting to understand, estrogen has a really close link to dopamine, which is what helps with the regulation of mood. And girls and women have so many changes across their lifespan, which is why so much of the diagnosis of women with ADHD is happening around the time of perimenopause. It's not just around women who are identifying or getting diagnosis for ADHD around the same time as their children. It also happens around the same time as the perimenopause, because it's that decline in estrogen causes an increase in their ADHD symptoms. So I'm going to move through a couple of these because, as you can imagine with ADHD, I've got so much to say on this topic. One of the risk factors we've got with girls and women with ADHD is around their impulsivity. It's not just about blurting out, it's also their risk factor for sexual behaviours. Girls with ADHD have got double their risk of teenage pregnancy and accidents. Research came out in 2013 and again in 2021 that the risk of premature death is doubled if their treatment isn't effective for ADHD. Effective treatment for ADHD has the possibility of adding, on average, 9 to 13 years. So what can we do as educators? We can provide examples of what's expected and manage expectations, provide explicit instructions, clear steps and nudges, use a hands-down approach with girls so they're less likely, because they will be less likely to volunteer answers. Encourage headphones, loops and white noise, and get neurodiverse professionals to come in to support that risk assessment. We can also ensure that all staff are aware of the pupil's specific needs and have a highly trained adult to lead that social skills support, and be aware of those subtle differences around an inattentive ADHD diagnosis. And that support around executive functioning difficulties is absolutely critical to supporting girls with ADHD in schools. And I would be absolutely so remiss of me not to talk about strengths, because it's starting to feel like a deficit model here. We are the most creative, empathetic, and absolutely resilient learners and workers, because we have periods of hyper focus. And as they say, if you want a difficult job doing, we can get it done in half the time. So what we don't want anybody to think is that this is a deficit of cognitive ability. And this is my favourite definition that's currently out there from Hallowell and Ratey. ADHD is a term that describes a way of being in the world. It's not entirely a disorder, nor entirely an asset. It's an array of traits specific to a unique kind of mind. It can be a distinct advantage or an abiding curse, depending on how a person manages it. So I'd like to thank you all for being with me today to try and raise awareness, and I'm open to questions. Thank you, Bennie.
Lizzie, that was fascinating, and I've got so much going through my brain, so I'm going to try and narrow it down to some tangible questions. So this, one of the things that you hear a lot in school is that ADHD, doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It's just poor parenting, or it's just behavior issues. Now, this is wildly frustrating, surely. When you hear this as an adult with a diagnosis, what is your reaction?
And I think it's really challenging when Super Nanny goes on Instagram and posts, like she did a couple of days ago, saying that, we can bring back naughty and ADHD and ABCD, because she's adding fuel to the fire there, and that is, I think, there's so much research where we're using brain scans, and we're actually starting to really focus on the neuroscience, because there's so much evidence, and it's frustrating to me. I can't actually find the words, really. I think the focus now on executive functioning skills, and where we can actually look at the cognitive science, and we can break it down into that, moving it away from ADHD, I think is actually helping teachers focus on, actually, I can understand this. If I look at short-term working memory, long-term memory, if I look at organizational skills, I can manage this in my classroom, and I can see the tangible benefits and how this fits in, rather than actually looking at this as being something. I've heard you talking to Esther about, nebulous concepts, and so often teachers feel disempowered in the classroom. Whereas when you talk about ADHD in the realm of it being executive functioning skills, I think teachers start to think this is something that actually I can support this young person with.
I think
definitely.
That shift in language, it's subtle, but the diagnosis of ADHD, I think, has carried so many connotations and judgments and sort of lack of belief, lack of belief in its existence, that I think actually the executive function part is really useful. And moving to the gendered nature of this, this talk that you've just given, I think previously, certainly in my experience, that people had thought that ADHD was a boys' issue, It was something to do with boys. And when you look at some of the things that are risk factors for girls, I wonder if they get dismissed because they are seen as very gendered, impulsivity, likely to get pregnant, all of those things are dismissed as sort of gendered behaviors as opposed to an ADHD thing.
I think so. I think when it comes to the hyperactive and impulsive diagnosis, absolutely. And that diagnostic criteria was only changed in 1980. But the biggest issue the biggest challenge we've got with ADHD is that there's been no studies involving girls until the late 90s. And the first longitudinal study started in 2002. So what we need to be doing is we need to be making sure that we've got more longitudinal studies. We need to be training up our clinicians and making sure that we're making as much noise as we can, because we've got massive cohorts of women and girls who just don't have access to updated clinicians. And we need to be training, but then we need to be training, making sure that the police force, because at-risk girls are coming into contact with police who need updated training, and then teachers and professionals, so that we've got a holistic approach to at-risk girls. But it's not just at risk, it's with an inattentive ADHD, you've got children who are girls who are conforming and have it and being misdiagnosed. And
I hear you about the need for people to have such a different understanding of not only just ADHD, but then how that intersects with some of our more insidious ideas about gender. Girls are quieter, girls are, whatever the term is, promiscuous. That's why these things happen, as opposed to seeing it as a neurological issue. It's more of a kind of social judgment. My last question, Lizzie, before I let you go, and I'm going to pick your brains about this later, I think, is about adults with ADHD in schools. So we have more people working in education who are now being diagnosed as adults, men and women, as having ADHD. How do schools cater for the needs of these individuals?
I think that's a brilliant question. I think I'm going to speak really bluntly, and I say, I think we as schools aren't the best at support. I'd love to see some excellent examples where schools are supporting the neurodiverse needs of their staff, and I'd love to hear from them, because they are out there. And I'd love to hear about them. I think that we don't have the right to question any of our staff, but I do think that we have the opportunity to promote and raise awareness. And I think that there are so many reasonable adjustments that we can put in place that are the same as we would offer to our children. And I think that there's still so much shame and stigma around there. And we can link it up so nicely with the menopause work that we're doing, because of the fluctuations in estrogen.
Absolutely. I think there definitely needs to be more awareness in the first instance, but what we then go on and do as a tangible action is
absolutely.
So I have to stop. I'm yelled at. But thank you so much for joining us today, Lizzie. Please do stay in touch. Please do follow Lizzie at Pegs UK on Twitter. And we thank you for your time. Have a lovely Saturday.
Thanks so much, Bennie, for the opportunity. Bye, everybody.
Brilliant. So another event done and dusted. We're just going to wrap up, and we are going to invite everyone who's still listening, or even if you watch this later, please can you put pen to paper and make a commitment. And my Diverse Ed pledge, think about that camel case for those capital letters. If you're on Twitter, tweet it out. If you're on YouTube, put it into the comments. I'm just going to put out the threads from the 12 speakers, and then Bennie's going to do some summarization. So Audrey talked about her goal for us to have more intersectional approaches to the DEI work in schools. Abed talked about his goal for there to be more Stammer awareness for both our pupils and our staff. Nicky shared lots of goals around societal, systemic and structural awareness when it comes to the menopause. Lisa shared her goal around decolonising and diversifying the MFL curriculum. Alison shared her goal around leveraging lived experience within the curriculum. Rob shared his goal from the project around creating a global curriculum perspective. Navid shared his goal around breaking through those ceilings that prevent leaders from rising. And Christala built on that with her goal around disrupting the leadership pipeline and breaking those molds. Esther M talked about her goal around the impact of DEI work on the pupils and on the curriculum. Adam talked about his goal around disrupting the status quo and making us all think about who are the gatekeepers. Esther C talked about her goal from her research around creating truly inclusive culture and ethos in our schools. And Lizzie's just finished with her goal around ADHD awareness for all. 12 brilliant speakers, Bennie. What are the threads you want to pull out?
It strikes me that we've got three strands here, and there's crossovers. One of the things that I've been struck by this morning is the awareness raising that's happened on topics that we haven't necessarily covered in other events. So I haven't heard a teacher talk about stammering from their own lived experience. The idea of the menopause, the ADHD in girls. So there's an imperative here, I think, for us to listen to voices that perhaps are not kind of the traditional areas to talk about. There are all of these subsections of our identities that there are some experts in, and to be a change maker, the other thread that's come out is this need for listening. Are we actually listening to people with lived experience in order to create those ethos, the culture in a school that is truly inclusive? Are we listening to the students? Are we listening to their cohorts? Are we their families, their communities? And then the final thread is that thread of disruption. What does it mean to disrupt? How do we actually tangibly make change? So all of the speakers have touched on versions of that, whether it's in an MFL curriculum, whether it's about creating an ethos in the first place or changing an ethos. So for me, those three things really resonated.
Yeah, and I'm picking out this idea of saying of what we're saying and what we're doing, and the kind of the alignment there, and moving from being passive to active, but how we hold ourselves and others accountable as well. So if we share some of our goals, then I'll do the diverse ed kind of collective goals, and then you and I can share our own. So one of the ways we've held ourselves to account is that we're part of the NHT collective pledge for DEI, and that was updated and we shared it a week ago. It's on our website, and a number of different national stakeholders have outlined their commitments for the year ahead. We're also one of the signatories of the Inclusion Lab's pledge around diversifying governance and diversifying the library. And our book, I think, is really our goal, our collective goal, that we've got each of those contributors and voices who have outlined their manifesto, their commitment to change within the system. So if you are reading the book, just go to that last commitment from every single person, and we've been putting them out on Insta over the last 6 months. What's your goal or goals, Bennie? I know there's probably more than one in there.
I definitely think it's to listen more, because I've got some areas that I feel like I have some expertise in, and there are other areas that I'm just really learning about. And that's not just about students, it's about adults as well. But for me, I think it's to go back to finishing the diversity in the curriculum book, because I'm learning so much. And even today, I've picked up things that I just think I want to include. So I've got a publishing deadline of April. So we've got to make sure that happens. So that's a real goal for me, because I want to capture people's voices and get them out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And my two goals, I think, going back to my reflection on Abed's contribution, and Richard, who's behind the scenes, and I talk about this quite a lot, about how can we make the website and our events as inclusive and accessible as possible. We found a loop this week that unless we have 1,000 followers on YouTube, we can't put subtitles on. So there's little things like that we consciously want to do differently. But I think I'm really going to take stock of making sure that we're making reasonable adjustments for our speakers at our events when they're virtual as well. And a personal goal of mine is that people will know that I'm doing executive coaching training, and I'm really looking for some men to coach. My network is so female heavy. If you are a male leader listening to this today and you want some coaching, please reach out. I really want to work with more men who are leaders, who are doing the DEI work. So just some signposting about what's coming up in the next few weeks. We've got a couple of free webinars this week, one around World Values Day, another one around DEI metrics. That was another thread that came up. And after half term, we've got a schools briefing around trans inclusion and safety in schools. And Bennie and I are then co-hosting the virtual conference Diversity in the Curriculum. So there's lots and lots of ways to get involved. We will share those on Twitter. We'll put them into an email to you all when the recording goes live on our website this week. But thank you so much to our 12 brilliant speakers today, and to everyone who joined us both live and with the recording, to interact with everyone. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next event in the spring.